After being cheated on, I climbed into the CEO's bed in the middle of the night. Her fiancé and stepmother were hanging out in the banquet lounge. In return, she got drunk and got into a man's luxury car. She wanted to just try it out, but the man was so addicted to her. Why, you want to run away after you're full? She raised her chin slightly, with a proud face. I don't need you to be responsible. The man covered her red lips. I want you to be responsible. Someone was extremely vicious and chased her relentlessly. He vowed to knock her down every day. After getting the marriage certificate, she found out that the man had been planning for her for a long time. He had set a trap long ago, just waiting for her to jump in. Chapter 1, Inside the Luxury Car. Are you serious? Inside the luxury car, under the dim lights, Jiang Luzi straddled Zhang Xiao's legs, boldly kissing him. Her cheeks flushed, and her gaze became hazy. Overcome with desire, her delicate hand eagerly reached for his belt. Zhang Xiao held her hands down, his voice husky. Are we being serious? Don't you want to? Jiang Luzi smiled seductively. Her fingertips slid into his shirt, twirling around. Zhang Xiao took a sharp breath. His eagle-like eyes turned red instantly, like a beast seeing its prey. You wanted this, don't regret it later. Jiang Luzi was pushed down onto the car seat. Her dress was torn apart. Outside the car, heavy rain poured down, but inside, the atmosphere was filled with passion. Jiang Luzi, caught in a whirlwind of pleasure and pain, was tossed between the two. Her broken moans almost escaped. Zhang Xiao's scorching breath brushed her ear. Let it out. Jiang Luzi bit her lip, unwilling to comply. He deliberately kept her in torment. Tortured by desire, Jiang Luzi sank her teeth into his shoulder. Zhang Xiao hissed, his breath suddenly heavy and rapid. A domineering kiss completely consumed her lips. How long had passed, she didn't know, but finally, the passion subsided. The swaying luxury car stopped. Jiang Luzi's long hair was a mess, her dress had been pulled down to her waist, her stockings and underwear were long gone. Her fair, smooth skin was covered with the marks he had left. Zhang Xiao narrowed his eyes, taking in the sight of her beauty. Another round. He gripped her slender waist, reigniting the flames. Jiang Luzi moaned softly and instinctively pushed him away. Enough, stop. I don't think it's enough. Zhang Xiao refused to let go, his voice rough. Seeing him about to kiss her again, Jiang Luzi quickly turned her face away. I really don't want it. If it weren't for the fact that she had been drugged tonight, she wouldn't have ended up in his luxury car, and wouldn't have initiated anything with him. One time, and you're satisfied. Zhang Xiao tilted her chin, forcing her face towards his, their gazes meeting. Jiang Luzi was momentarily stunned. He couldn't possibly know that she had been drugged earlier, could he? But maybe it was for the best. It was just an adult game, both taking what they needed. Thank you, Mr. Zhang. Jiang Luzi took a deep breath, offering a polite, detached thanks. She then sat up straight and began to put on her clothes. Zhang Xiao gave her a smirk. Just, thank you. Jiang Luzi pretended not to notice the dangerous anger in his eyes. After a brief hesitation, she added, then, I'll invite you to dinner sometime. A trace of sarcasm passed over Zhang Xiao's wild and handsome face. He reached out, pulling her back into his arms. I was just used as a cure for your fire in the car, and you think a dinner will settle it? He bit her earlobe, full of punishment. Jiang Luzi frowned in pain. What do you want then? Zhang Xiao's gaze was intense, full of amusement. At least let me take control. Jiang Luzi trembled. She could feel his body temperature rising sharply, his reaction was intense. She quickly struggled, no. But Zhang Xiao ignored her protests. Want to continue in the car, or change places? His eyes were deep, his heated breath brushing against her cheek. Jiang Luzi couldn't stop herself from shuddering. He still wanted more. But she didn't want him touching her anymore. The drug's effect had almost worn off. Most importantly, she had been taken so forcefully earlier, her body felt like it was falling apart. She hadn't expected him to be this strong in this regard. She could not handle another round. Really, no more, it hurts. Jiang Luzi's voice softened in plea. Zhang Xiao studied her for a few seconds before finally letting go. He casually lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up around him. His black shirt was open, revealing his solid, muscular chest. He was both rebellious and wild. But Jiang Luzi was afraid if she stayed any longer, he might overpower her again. She quickly adjusted her clothes, pushed open the car door, and stumbled out. But as soon as her feet hit the ground, her legs buckled, and she fell forward. It was over. She looked like she had indulged too much. Jiang Luzi panicked and shut her eyes. But instead of pain, she was caught in a scorching embrace. The scent of male hormones filled the air, surrounding her. Jiang Luzi trembled even more. What the rush to leave? Zhang Xiao's husky voice suddenly rang in her ear. Jiang Luzi was startled back to her senses. She quickly found an excuse. It's getting late, I need to go home. Zhang Xiao's eyes darkened. Go home on time. So obedient. Millimeter. Jiang Luzi lowered her eyes, not daring to meet his gaze. But Zhang Xiao gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. Don't forget, you still owe me one. His gaze was scorching, like molten lava, ready to burn her into ashes. Mr. Zhang. Jiang Luzi's red lips trembled. She thought he was about to do something again. But instead, his long, distinct fingers only brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. He wasn't planning to continue. Forget about tonight, I'll take you home, he said in a low voice. Hearing he would take her home, Jiang Luzi immediately panicked. No need, I'll call a friend to pick me up. Of course, Miss Jiang already has an engagement, and it wouldn't look good if someone saw you leaving in my luxury car. Zhang Xiao suddenly moved closer, mocking her. But does your fiancé, Qiao Haizhou, know how wild you were in my car just now? Jiang Luzi's face changed multiple times. Hearing him mention her fiancé, Qiao Haizhou, she didn't panic. Instead, a flash of barely noticeable anger crossed her eyes. She had drunk more than usual at the banquet earlier because she had caught her fiancé, Qiao Haizhou, in the lounge fooling around with her stepmother. Her engagement to Qiao Haizhou was coming up soon. But he had always been flirtatious, with rumors about women circulating frequently. Now he had even dragged her stepmother into the mess. Jiang Luzi couldn't take it anymore. Zhang Xiao, standing close to her, took in the anger on her face with a subtle look. I'm just in a family arrangement with him, no need to take it seriously. Jiang Luzi smiled bitterly, lifting her head to meet his gaze. But it felt like his deep, sharp gaze pierced her soul. Her breath caught, and a heavy sense of oppression overwhelmed her. Jiang Luzi didn't like this feeling. Instinctively, she struggled free from his embrace and forced herself out of the car. A cold wind blew in, and her already torn clothes made her shiver. Put this on. Zhang Xiao suddenly threw his suit jacket at her. Jiang Luzi grabbed it, and the car door slammed shut. As she watched his luxury car drive away, she shivered in the cold wind. In the end, she decided to put on the jacket, still warm with his body heat. Chapter 2, Drunk and Drugged. After taking a cab home, Jiang Luzi rushed straight into the bathroom. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw the marks left all over her body from Zhang Xiao. She could only think that it was insane. Zhang Xiao was one of the top elites in S-City, a man feared by all, a living king of hell. He was also the dream lover of countless women. Rumors said he was ruthless, decisive, and cold-hearted. Women who had any relations with him were never able to escape a bad end. She never imagined he could be so fierce in bed as well. Even now, Jiang Luzi could still feel the pain in her lower body. Her body felt as if it might fall apart. She ran a full bathtub of hot water for herself, lying in it and resting her head on the edge, feeling the warmth slowly easing the pain throughout her body. Staring at the ceiling, Jiang Luzi replayed the events of the night in her mind. She had originally accompanied her fiancé, Qiao Haizhou, to the banquet. However, Jiang Luzi didn't like social events, so she had drunk very little at first and hardly interacted with anyone. It wasn't until she stepped out to get some air and saw Qiao Haizhou with her stepmother, Zhuang Yichuan, in the lounge, that things took a turn. She was shocked and, upon returning to the banquet, ended up drinking a lot more. That was probably when someone drugged her. But who would want to harm her? She didn't know anyone at the banquet well, and most of them were either Qiao Haizhou's relatives or hers, with whom she had little contact. The only person with a grudge against her was her stepmother, Zhuang Yichuan. Before marrying her foster father, Fu Qianyun, Zhuang Yichuan had been her close friend. After becoming her stepmother, they had a falling out. Jiang Luzi never expected that Zhuang Yichuan would successfully seduce her foster father and still not be satisfied. Now, she was secretly fooling around with her fiancé, Xiao Haozhou. Could it be that Zhuang Yichuan deliberately drugged her tonight, intending to push her onto some old man at the banquet and ruin her engagement with Xiao Haozhou? The more Jiang Luzi thought about it, the more she felt that this possibility was very high. Fortunately, after realizing something was wrong with her, she immediately threw herself at Zhang Xiao. At that moment, all she could think about was this one idea: if she had to relieve herself, she might as well find a man with the best looks and body, so it wouldn't be a total loss. Anyway, Xiao Haozhou had already betrayed her, and she no longer needed to stay loyal to him. She hadn't expected Zhang Xiao to be so forceful. Jiang Luzi almost passed out from his strength. Now, her body felt completely drained. She slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep in the bathtub. She woke up again to the sound of her phone ringing. The water in the bathtub had already cooled down a lot. She shivered as she got out of the tub and answered the phone. "Hello. Where are you?" A familiar deep voice came from the other side of the phone. It was her foster father, Fu Qianyun. Jiang Luzi froze for a few seconds, then replied, "I've returned to the apartment. Yichuan said you drank quite a lot tonight. What happened?" Fu Qianyun asked, his tone unhappy. "It's nothing, I was just bored. I had a few more drinks," Jiang Luzi hurriedly explained. She knew Fu Qianyun had always been strict with her, and she had never acted out like this in public by drinking excessively. Tonight, everything was because of her stepmother, Zhuang Yichuan, and her fiancé, Xiao Haozhou. She didn't expect Zhuang Yichuan to report her to her foster father so quickly. "Come back right now," Fu Qianyun ordered in a low voice, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Jiang Luzi had no choice but to dry herself off and get dressed. Her foster father, Fu Qianyun, was a man of authority, and she couldn't defy him in the slightest. For Jiang Luzi, he was both a benefactor and an elder, but also someone she feared deeply. 10 years ago, when the Jiang family went bankrupt, her biological father ran off with the last of the family's money, and she never heard from him again. Her mother tried to support them both but worked 3 jobs every day, and they were constantly harassed by creditors. One day, one of the creditors tried to take advantage of them and force them. It was Fu Qianyun who saved them both. He brought them into his mansion and paid off their debts. From then on, Jiang Luzi lived a stable life, though as a dependent in Fu Qianyun's household. Her mother became Fu Qianyun's mistress. Despite Fu Qianyun's deep affection for her mother, his father, Fu Old Master, vehemently opposed Fu Qianyun marrying a woman with a child from a previous marriage. Fu Qianyun wouldn't let her mother go, and several times her mother tried to escape with her, only to be brought back by Fu Qianyun. In the end, Fu Qianyun used Jiang Luzi to force her mother to stay with him. With no choice, her mother agreed to become his mistress and brought Jiang Luzi along as an illegitimate daughter. However, her mother had suffered too much and, after overworking herself to pay off her father's debts, her health deteriorated, and she passed away not long after. Jiang Luzi became an orphan with no father or mother. She was supposed to be sent to an orphanage. But Fu Qianyun, seeing her as her late mother's daughter, allowed her to stay and even had her recognize him as a godfather. Over the years, he had taken care of her under the guise of a foster father. She had thus become the Fu family's daughter. Jiang Luzi hurried back to Fu Qianyun's mansion. It was already midnight, and the servants had all gone to bed. She pushed open the mansion door, and a faint, moaning sound immediately reached her ears. Jiang Luzi froze. She instinctively looked in the direction of the sound. In the living room, Zhuang Yichuan was naked, clinging to Fu Qianyun's strong waist, writhing under him uncontrollably. "Our godfather, I wanted," Zhuang Yichuan screamed, her hands gripping Fu Qianyun tightly, her body trembling uncontrollably. In contrast to her nakedness, Fu Qianyun was fully dressed in a suit, his pants still on. Even in this moment, his deep, dark eyes showed no emotion, his cold features as fierce and dangerous as ever. In his eyes, there was only coldness and a release of desire. Zhuang Yichuan, on the other hand, lay beneath him, melting into a puddle of desire, her voice still calling out, "Godfather, Godfather." Jiang Luzi stood frozen at the door, as if struck by lightning. She stood motionless, her mind in turmoil. It was the first time she had ever caught them in such a passionate moment. She had always thought that with Fu Qianyun's usual coldness toward Zhuang Yichuan, it was impossible for him to touch her. But now, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was already so late, yet they hadn't rested. They were even going at it in the living room. Zhuang Yichuan's constant cries of "Godfather" pierced her ears. She had thought that with Zhuang Yichuan already being Fu Qianyun's wife, she should be calling him husband, not godfather. Why was she calling him that? Was it for the sake of spicing things up? Or was there another reason? Chapter 3, her major client. Jiang Luzi was utterly confused, but didn't think too much about it. All she knew was that she had come back at the wrong time. She had accidentally walked in on her foster father and her former best friend in the middle of something inappropriate. But now, her ex-best friend had successfully climbed the social ladder and became her stepmother. Even though Zhuang Yichuan and her foster father, Fu Qianyun, had a nearly 30-year age difference, they were still a married couple. In the end, Jiang Luzi was now the outsider in the Fu family. Jiang Luzi let out a self-deprecating smile and silently left the villa. Zhuang Yichuan, lost in the heat of the moment, noticed Jiang Luzi's awkward departure from the corner of her eye and couldn't help but curve her lips into a victorious smile. She couldn't help but call out more seductively, "Godfather, you're so bad, don't stop." After returning to her apartment, Jiang Luzi barely slept all night. She only managed to close her eyes for a short while when it was nearly dawn. But soon, the alarm clock woke her up. She drowsily opened her eyes and glanced at the time. Hastily, she got up and dressed. She had just graduated from university and was interning at a company. Originally, after graduation, her foster father Fu Qianyun had arranged a position for her at the Fu Corporation. However, Jiang Luzi had refused. She wanted to be independent and no longer rely on her foster father. So, she applied for a position at a company called Xingmao and worked in sales. Jiang Luzi quickly got out of bed and washed up. But then, she noticed a message from an unfamiliar number on her phone. Hesitantly, she opened it. "Your underwear was left in my car." Jiang Luzi's head buzzed instantly. It was obvious who the message was from. How did Zhang Xiao get her private number? But then she realized, with his influence, it was probably easy for him to get her number. Still, Jiang Luzi couldn't help but frown. She didn't want anything to do with this man anymore. So, with her still wet hands from washing her face, she tapped on the screen and replied, "Throw it away, thanks." After sending the message, she put her phone in her bag, changed shoes, and hurried out. When Jiang Luzi arrived at the company with dark circles under her eyes, sales department manager Chen Yuan had just stepped out of her office. "Didn't sleep well last night." Chen Yuan stared at her for a few seconds before frowning. "Yeah." Jiang Luzi gave an awkward smile. "Then quickly fix your makeup. We're going to meet a major client soon." Chen Yuan immediately ordered. "Okay." Jiang Luzi followed manager Chen Yuan to a high-rise building in the CBE Central Business District. After explaining their purpose to the receptionist, they were led to a waiting area, where they had to wait for several hours. After all, they were just from a small company, and no one even bothered to give them a second glance. Finally, the door to a conference room opened, and a group of people in formal attire walked out. Leading the group was Zhang Xiao. He was wearing a high-end tailor-made suit, the fabric perfectly outlining his tall and strong figure. His chiseled face was illuminated by the light, as he walked towards them with an imposing aura. As he moved, his presence was sharp and dominant. The moment Jiang Luzi saw him, she felt a pang of guilt and wished she could hide. But to her surprise, manager Chen Yuan grabbed her and followed him. "President Zhang." Manager Chen Yuan hurriedly called out, chasing after Zhang Xiao and his group. Jiang Luzi's eyelids twitched at the sound of her call. Could it be that the major client manager Chen Yuan had brought her to meet today was Zhang Xiao? If she had known, she would have come up with an excuse to not come. But now that manager Chen Yuan had already dragged her in front of Zhang Xiao, Jiang Luzi had no reason to pretend not to see such a big shot. She gathered up her courage, lifted her head, and found that Zhang Xiao was also looking at her. Their eyes met her gaze, awkward, embarrassed, surprised, and confused. His gaze was deep and intense. Jiang Luzi froze, but she couldn't immediately look away. She had no choice but to stare at Zhang Xiao. Thankfully, the eye contact only lasted a second or two before manager Chen Yuan stepped in front of her. She respectfully greeted Zhang Xiao and introduced herself. "President Zhang, I'm Chen Yuan, the sales manager at Xingmao Technology. We had an appointment with your secretary earlier." Before she could finish her sentence, Zhang Xiao raised an eyebrow. An appointment? His cold voice sounded emotionless. His assistant immediately noticed his impatience and quickly answered, "I don't think so." But President Zhang. Manager Chen Yuan looked anxious. Their company had been communicating with Zhang Xiao's secretary to arrange an appointment. But Zhang Xiao had never confirmed it. Until today, his secretary suddenly said that he might have half an hour free after his meeting. Manager Chen Yuan had rushed over with her team immediately. But judging by Zhang Xiao's distant attitude, it seemed like their company had no chance this time. Just as manager Chen Yuan was feeling disheartened, Zhang Xiao spoke slowly. "Is she also from your company?" She was caught off guard, looking up to realize that Zhang Xiao's gaze was focused on Jiang Luzi behind her. Suddenly, she had an epiphany and quickly pushed Jiang Luzi forward, enthusiastically introducing her. "Her name is Jiang Luzi, a graduate of a university. She is currently interning in our sales department." At that moment, Jiang Luzi had a bad premonition. It felt like she was being sold out by manager Chen Yuan. And in truth, manager Chen Yuan had always chosen Jiang Luzi for the sales department because of her looks and figure. This natural advantage was crucial in their line of work. Now, she was glad that she had brought Jiang Luzi with her today. After all, it was a world where appearances mattered. Even someone like Zhang Xiao, so high and mighty, was no exception. In turn, Zhang Xiao raised an eyebrow, his expression inscrutable. He was surprised that, as Fu's daughter, Jiang Luzi hadn't gone straight into the Fu Corporation after graduation. Instead, she came to work at such a small, unknown company in a sales role. Jiang Luzi's spine stiffened, and cold sweat began to bead on her palms. Manager Chen Yuan smiled widely, explaining, "President Zhang, don't let her title as an intern fool you. She's quick-witted and highly intelligent. This project is entirely her brainchild. Would you like her to explain it to you herself?" Hearing this, Jiang Luzi couldn't help but feel a few black lines appear on her forehead. Was it really okay for the manager to praise her like this? An eerie silence filled the air. All eyes were on her. Everyone's gaze was different. Jiang Luzi, under immense pressure, instinctively clenched her fists. Her heart was in her throat. If Zhang Xiao rejected her publicly, how embarrassing would that be? The tension stretched for over 10 seconds. Then, a deep, powerful voice suddenly echoed. "Come here." Zhang Xiao spoke only those few words before turning and walking away. Before Jiang Luzi could react, manager Chen Yuan gave her a shove. Startled, Jiang Luzi looked up, and manager Chen Yuan immediately gave her a look, signaling her to follow Zhang Xiao. Chapter 4. She threw herself on him. The elevator is descending at a constant speed. Zhang Xiao and Jiang Luzi were the only ones left in the small space. Jiang Luzi's whole body was tense, and she didn't dare to breathe too loudly. With all kinds of complicated emotions, he stared at the back of Zhang Xiao, who was standing in front of him. He is tall and straight. It gives people an inexplicable sense of oppression. Until the elevator reaches the parking lot on the second floor below ground. Zhang Xiao stepped out. Jiang Luzi reacted and hurried to catch up. They came to a distinguished Rolls-Royce luxury car. The driver bent down respectfully and opened the back door for Zhang Xiao. Zhang Xiao unbuttoned a button of his suit and was about to get in the car. At this moment, he seemed to remember that there was someone following him. So he turned around and looked at Jiang Luzi deeply. Jiang Luzi immediately understood what he meant. He wanted her to get in the car with him. Even though she wanted to stay away from him, she couldn't forget the task assigned to her by her manager. Whether their sales department can impress the big boss Zhang Xiao and sign a cooperation contract with their company depends entirely on her. Jiang Luzi got into his car with a businesslike attitude. During the war, Yao was leaning back in his chair, resting his eyes. Sensing movement beside him, he raised his eyelids slightly and glanced to the right. Jiang Luzi, who had just sat down, was wearing a white tight-fitting miniskirt suit. Her long hair was tied up with a hairpin, revealing her slender and graceful neck. When she sat down with her legs sideways, her skirt was pulled up to 10 centimeters above her thighs, and her pair of long, straight, white legs were particularly eye-catching. Zhang Xiao's throat tightened immediately. Thinking of her initiative in the car last night, his black pupils became even deeper. After Jiang Luzi sat down, she realized that the skirt she was wearing today was a bit short. She tugged at the hem of her skirt awkwardly and glanced at Zhang Xiao subconsciously. Seeing that his attention was not on her at the moment, she breathed a sigh of relief. The driver has started the car and driven out of the underground garage. Jiang Luzi lowered her head and flipped open the document that Manager Chen had just handed to her, preparing to introduce their company's cooperation project in detail to Zhang Xiao. Suddenly the driver in front slammed on the brakes. Jiang Luzi was caught off guard and threw herself towards him uncontrollably. A strong scent of male hormones hits my nose. Her heart skipped a beat unconsciously. But just as she looked up, Zhang Xiao happened to look down at her. She just bumped into his eyes that were as deep as the sea. The two looked at each other for a while, and Zhang Xiao suddenly said, "Your heartbeat is very fast." Jiang Luzi's eyes flashed with panic. "Maybe. I was frightened just now." "Really?" Zhang Xiao narrowed his eyes. "Yes." Jiang Luzi nodded quickly. Zhang Xiao solemnly ordered the driver in front, "Old Zhao, be careful next time." "Sorry, boss, I get it." The driver was so scared that he was sweating and quickly made an assurance. Jiang Luzi was fully aware of how ambiguous her posture was as she lay on top of him. She was anxious to prop herself up and get off him. Zhang Xiao groaned, suddenly hugged her slender waist tightly, and pressed her to sit on his lap. "Boss Zhang, don't." Jiang Luzi's heart was filled with alarm and she shouted in shock and shame. "Don't want what?" Zhang Xiao lowered his head and moved closer to her, his hot breath falling down. "If you keep pushing me down like this, I'll have to give it up even if I don't want it." His meaningful words made her heart tighten. Jiang Luzi's expression of shame and anger had not yet faded, and she suddenly lowered her head. "I actually saw my hand pressing on him." Her pretty face suddenly turned completely red. She quickly let go as if she had been electrocuted and quickly stepped away from him. "Sky." Jiang Luzi was so embarrassed that she wished she could find a hole to crawl into. The atmosphere in the car suddenly became hot. Zhang Xiang tried his best to barely suppress the scorching flames that suddenly sprang up in his lower abdomen. Jiang Luzi was even more at a loss. It was such a big luxury car that she didn't know where to put her hands. I could only pick up the document that had just fallen on the ground, and hold it tightly, and tighter again. After she adjusted her mood, she cleared her throat. Then he gritted his teeth and said, "Boss Zhang, shall I introduce our company's project to you?" Zhang Xiao turned his head and glanced at her. Jiang Luzi tried hard to keep smiling and looked back. But my heart was beating fast. He wouldn't just kick her out of the car because of her accidental fall just now, right? Fortunately, Yao had no intention of seeking revenge during the war. He responded to her with a neutral hum. Jiang Luzi sat up straight, opened the document, and began to introduce it to him carefully. She spoke slowly but clearly. I don't know whether Zhang Xiao listened carefully or not. He didn't say a word the whole time. There was no extra expression on Zhang's face. It's hard to get a glimpse into what's going on in his mind. After Jiang Luzi finished her introduction, a fine layer of sweat unconsciously seeped out of her palms. I caught a glimpse of his cold and stern profile from the corner of my eye, feeling uneasy, not being able to figure out what he was thinking. The atmosphere in the car was very quiet. The silence was suffocating. After a while, Zhang Xiao suddenly turned to look at her. "Are you done?" Jiang Luzi didn't have time to look away and just stared into his eyes. "That's it." She nodded immediately. "Wartime." He stared at her deeply with his eyes, pursed his thin lips and said no more. Jiang Luzi felt extremely pressured and uncomfortable when he looked at her like that. Just then the luxury car slowly stopped. Zhang Xiao opened the car door first and got out. Jiang Luzi was stunned for a moment before she came back to her senses from the tense eye contact with Zhang Xiao. She subconsciously looked out the car window. There are large tracts of green grass and a vast area. Blue sky and white clouds. In the distance, someone was swinging a club. Here it is. Golf course. When did the car arrive here? Jiang Luzi had just been introducing their company's cooperation project to Zhang Xiao in the car. I didn't even notice where the luxury car was going. At this moment, Zhang Xiang was standing outside the car, looking at the golf course, as if he had forgotten her existence. Jiang Luzi sat in the car in a daze. When he was hesitating whether he should go down, Zhang Xiao suddenly turned around. "You can go back now." Jiang Luzi was in a daze for a moment and nodded. I thought that after she had introduced herself, he would send a driver to take her back. Unexpectedly, the driver got out of the car soon. Followed Zhang Xiao and walked towards the golf course. Jiang Luzi stood there in a daze. How is she going to get back now? Take a taxi back. You can't get a taxi here, right? Walk back. Even more unrealistic. Seeing that Zhang Xiao was about to go far away, Jiang Luzi had to open the car door, get out and chase after him. Boss Zhang. Jiang Luzi hurriedly chased after him and called out to him. Anything else? Zhang Xiao turned his head and looked at her meaningfully. Jiang Luzi bit her lip. She actually wanted to ask how to get a ride back to the city from here. But before she could open her mouth, she heard Zhang Xiao suddenly tease her playfully. Do you still want to do what I did last night? Chapter 5. He broke into her dressing room. Jiang Luzi's pretty face suddenly turned red. Just as I was about to speak, a male voice suddenly came from not far away. Ayao? Zhang Xiao then looked up and saw a man in golf clothes walking towards them. Jiang Luzi also looked in the direction of the sound. A handsome young man soon came up to them. Wow, you brought a beautiful lady this time. Rong Shushi's gaze quickly shifted from Zhang Xiao to Jiang Luzi beside him. He walked up to her with great interest and said hello, I'm Rong Shushi. Jiang Luzi didn't know him, but she saw that he was so polite and enthusiastic. I couldn't help but nodded at him. Hello, I'm Jiang Luzi. After saying hello, Rong Shushi turned to look at Zhang Xiao again. What's the wind blowing today? You actually brought a beautiful lady here too. When Jiang Luzi heard this, she knew that he had misunderstood her relationship with Zhang Xiao. I thought she was brought here by Zhang Xiao. But in fact, she just happened to get in Zhang Xiao's car for business and came here with him. Beauty, is this your first time here? Let a Yao show you around later. Rong Shushi said with a smile, and asked someone to drive a golf cart over and asked her to get in. Jiang Luzi went to see Zhang Xiao awkwardly, hoping he could explain. But he didn't say a word, and instead acquiesced to Rong Shushi's invitation for her to get in the car. Jiang Luzi couldn't refuse their kindness, so she had to get into the car with them. Rong Shushi and Zhang Xiao started chatting in the car and seemed to have a good relationship. Jiang Luzi's cell phone also rang at this time. She took it out and looked at the name on the caller ID. Xiao Haozhou. Hang up without hesitation. From last night till now, Xiao Haozhou has called her several times in a row. Jiang Luzi didn't answer any of them. Whenever she heard his voice now, she would instinctively feel sick. Her mind involuntarily recalled the scene of catching him fooling around with her stepmother in the banquet lounge last night. Ever since she and Xiao Haozhou got engaged, Xiao Haozhou has always been involved in scandals. Jiang Luzi turned a blind eye to it all. But this time he really went too far. It actually got to her stepmother. She could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Soon they arrived at the VIP club area inside the stadium. Rong Shushi got out of the car first. Jiang Luzi saw Zhang Xiao coming down and followed him down. Rong Shushi chatted with them all their way to the locker room. He had already changed his clothes and was standing outside the door waiting. Zhang Xiao walked straight into the locker room. As soon as he stepped through the door, he suddenly remembered something. He turned and looked at Jiang Luzi. Jiang Luzi immediately responded tactfully, I'll wait here. Zhang Xiao. He didn't say anything else and walked straight into the locker room. Rong Shushi curiously asked her, how long have you known Yao? Jiang Luzi's eyes flickered, not long. We just met last night. Rong Shushi raised his eyebrows and asked, why don't you go in with him and change your clothes? Jiang Luzi smiled awkwardly, I don't know how to play golf. Rong Shushi raised his thin lips, no way, I can let Yao teach you. But if you don't mind, I can teach you. Rong Shushi volunteered again. They were so enthusiastic when we first met. Plus, she's already at the golf course. Jiang Luzi finally had no choice but to go into the locker room to change clothes. The dressing room is large and fully equipped. Jiang Luzi walked into a room at random. He took off his clothes and prepared to change into the golf suit prepared inside. At this time, her cell phone rang again. It was Xiao Haozhou who called again. He has bombarded her with more than a dozen calls since last night. Jiang Luzi couldn't bear it anymore and answered the call. Cece, what's wrong with you? Why haven't you answered my calls since last night? Xiao Haizhou's dissatisfied voice came. Jiang Luzi rolled her eyes, too lazy to expose him. Doesn't he know what he did with his stepmother last night? He even had the nerve to question her. If I don't answer your call, it means I don't want to care about you. Jiang Luzi replied bluntly. Xiao Haizhou's expression was shocked. He seemed to have not expected that she would dare to speak to him like that. You don't contact me again in the future. Jiang Luzi interrupted him directly. Xiao Haizhou was even more stunned. What do you mean? Nothing, I just want to break up with you. Jiang Luzi replied coldly. After saying that, he turned off the phone, so as to avoid being harassed by Xiao Haizhou again. If she was not eager to leave the Fu family and get rid of her adoptive father's control, she would not have agreed to the marriage with the Xiao family. Xiao Haizhou was a playboy, but she didn't care about him. But that doesn't mean she has no bottom line. This time, Xiao Haizhou really touched her bottom line. She had to reconsider her marriage to him. Jiang Luzi sighed deeply and was about to lower her head to change into her golf clothes. Suddenly, the door of the locker room behind was opened. A cool masculine scent rushed in along with the cold wind. Jiang Luzi was startled and didn't have time to react. The next second, her waist tightened and she fell into a hot embrace. "R!" Jiang Luzi exclaimed and saw the handsome face of the man behind her through the mirror in the dressing room. He was so frightened that his face turned pale. Her eyes widened. "How did you get in?" Zhang Xiao looked at her wantonly with his deep eyes. Holding her slender waist, he pressed tightly against her back. The two were very close at this time. Zhang Xiao's breath brushed past her ears, causing her heart to beat faster. In the small dressing room, Jiang Luzi had nowhere to hide. The two maintained this posture. The breathing sounds in my ears gradually became heavier, until Zhang Xiao's voice suddenly sounded above her head. "Break up." Jiang Luzi. Could it be that he overheard her conversation with Xiao Haizhou just now? But what does this have to do with him? "Mr. Zhang, you." Jiang Luzi raised her head and looked at him hesitantly. My heart was filled with ups and downs. Zhang Xiao's deep eyes seemed to see through her thoughts at once. He suddenly lowered his head and approached her, his thin and cold lips almost touching her fair cheek, as if he wanted to swallow her into his stomach. "Don't worry, I won't hold you responsible just because you slept with me last night." His low voice was ambiguous yet a bit evil. Jiang Luzi's heart sank. He instinctively turned his face away to calm his confusion. He said he wouldn't rely on her, so what is he doing now? Jiang Luzi frowned and was about to speak when she heard footsteps. "Ayao, are you okay?" Rong Shushi waited outside for a long time but didn't see them come out, so he decided to go in and take a look. But seeing all the locker room doors closed, he wasn't sure which one Zhang Xiao was in, so he shouted. Jiang Luzi's breathing instinctively tightened when she heard the sound. I was so frightened that I didn't dare to breathe. For fear of being discovered by Rong Shushi outside, she and Zhang Xiao were in a dressing room at the moment. It seems like they are having an affair. Chapter 7. She actually kissed him. Jiang Luzi was startled. My heart instantly rose to my throat. "What are you doing? Wrong posture." Zhang Xiao raised his slender eyebrows slightly. "Have you forgotten what I taught you just now?" Jiang Luzi's expression froze. He licked his lips unconsciously out of nervousness. What did he just teach me? She couldn't remember anything at the moment. She only remembered that he had hugged her tightly and heard his thick masculine scent in her ears. "I'll teach you again." Zhang Xiao spoke in a low and hoarse voice, very patiently. "No." Jiang Luzi's temple suddenly jumped. He turned around quickly and shouted. She didn't want him to take advantage of her in broad daylight again. The worst that can happen is that you just don't learn it. But she didn't expect that as soon as she turned her neck, Zhang Xiao's handsome face was so close to her. Jiang Luzi's red lips accidentally brushed against his handsome face. That was enough to captivate everyone. Time seemed to stand still at this moment. Jiang Luzi's eyes widened, as if she had forgotten to react. She really didn't mean it. She swore. I never expected that when I turned around at this moment, I would kiss his face. Jiang Luzi's fair face and ears were instantly flushed. The golf club in his hand fell to the ground. You're not concentrating on your studies, but you're thinking about me. During the war, Yao's narrowed eyes revealed a bit of laziness and evil. Jiang Luzi was so upset that she almost couldn't even cry. Boss Jean, She wanted to explain clearly. But I found that in this situation, no explanation seemed to be sufficient. She had indeed kissed him just now. Rong Shushi watched from the side and finally understood why Zhang Xiao didn't answer him just now. It turned out that he was already pregnant with a beautiful woman. Although he was puzzled as to why Zhang Xiao suddenly changed his personality. But now is obviously not the time to ask such questions. Rong Shushi's mouth twitched. Yao, you guys fight, I'm going to rest for a while. He really didn't want to be a light bulb here anymore, so he gave the caddy a look. The caddy was tactful enough to get on the golf cart with him and leave together. Only Jiang Luzi and Zhang Xiao are left here. Jiang Luzi suddenly had a bad feeling. Sure enough, the next second, Zhang Xiao pressed close to him. His scorching breath ironed her cheeks, and his voice was low and hoarse. Play ball, or continue what we did last night. Jiang Luzi's brain buzzed at that moment. She panicked. Continue. Playing. Before she could finish the last two words, she was picked up by Zhang Xiao. Zhang Xiao carried her directly into another golf cart and was eager to kiss her. Wait a moment. Jiang Luzi struggled anxiously in his arms. Could he wait for her to finish? I can't wait. Zhang Xiao pressed his thin lips against hers eagerly and clasped her slender waist with one hand. God knows how much he wanted her when he was teaching her how to play golf just now. At this moment, his mind was full of her taste last night. I wish I could execute her right here and now. Jiang Luzi quickly put her hand on his chest. I just said to continue playing. She cried eagerly. She was afraid that Zhang Xiao would misunderstand her again. Zhang Xiao was stunned for a moment. The action of kissing her stopped for a moment. How dare you play tricks on me? His brows were furrowed, his handsome face was gloomy, and he looked like a storm was about to come. Jiang Luzi's red lips trembled. I didn't. How dare she play tricks on him? She wouldn't dare to do that even if she had 10 courages. He was indeed too impatient just now and didn't even let her finish her words. Can she be blamed for this? During the war, Yao's handsome face was filled with coldness and sharpness. Their whole person exudes a dangerous aura, which makes people shudder. Do you know what happens if you anger me? Zhang Xiao clenched her jaw, his tone cold and mixed with a hint of anger. Boss Zhang, I was wrong. Jiang Luzi's heart trembled. He lowered his eyes and quickly admitted his mistake. What's wrong? Zhang Xiao's tone was gloomy and fierce. Jiang Luzi felt guilty and didn't dare to look him in the eyes. She stammered in a hoarse voice, I didn't explain it to you clearly just now. She should have said playing ball first so that he wouldn't misunderstand. Hearing this, Zhang Xiao's handsome face seemed to become even uglier. Jiang Luzi lowered her head and could not see the expression on his face at this moment. But I could feel the strange and dangerous aura emanating from him. The air around became even more stagnant and cold. Jiang Luzi just felt that she was doomed. She thought of a solution in a hurry, and said in a soft and tender voice, Boss Zhang, you are a magnanimous person, I believe you will not bother with a little woman like me. Zhang Xiao said coldly, sorry, I always care about it. Jiang Luzi choked on her red lips. Why is she so unlucky? Zhang Xiao suddenly let go of her. A cold and indifferent voice sounded above her head, get out of the car. Jiang Luzi didn't react for a moment. Zhang Xiao's tall and straight body suddenly pressed towards her. Why, do you want to continue? The distance he suddenly closed made Jiang Luzi feel uneasy. She hurriedly shook her head, took a few steps back, and fell off the golf cart unexpectedly. Fortunately, the ground was covered with thick grass and she didn't get hurt. During the war, Yao Jian frowned. He extended a hand toward her. But Jiang Luzi just lowered her head and rubbed her sore butt, and didn't notice it at all. Zhang Xiao finally lost his patience. When Jiang Luzi finally raised her head, what she saw was his golf cart driving away from her. She was left alone on the court. Fortunately, after a while, the stadium staff took her back. Jiang Luzi never saw Zhang Xiao again. She took the golf course bus back to the city. She was planning to go back to the company to report, but unexpectedly a familiar black car drove up to her side. Miss, please get in the car, the master wants to see you. The driver was Mo Chen, the assistant of her adoptive father Fu Qianyun. Jiang Lu's heart skipped a beat. There is no way to avoid disaster. She had no choice but to get on the car. As soon as she entered the Fu villa, she saw her adoptive father Fu Qianyun sitting on the sofa drinking with a gloomy face. Jiang Luzi took a deep breath. "Daddy, are you looking for me?" Fu Qianyun raised his head and drank the half-glass of wine in his hand. He raised his head, staring at her with a cold and sinister look in his eyes. After a while, he spoke in a low voice and ordered, "Come here." Jiang Luzi hesitated for a moment and slowly walked towards him. It stopped less than a meter away from him. "Come and sit down." Fu Qianyun motioned for her to sit on the sofa next to him. Jiang Luzi's heart sank. She couldn't help but recall the scene she saw last night of her adoptive father and her former best friend Zhuang Yichuan making love on this sofa. "My feet suddenly felt like they were nailed down and I couldn't move an inch." "Daddy, let's talk about this right here." She tried hard to keep a certain distance from her adoptive father so that she would feel more secure. Unexpectedly, Fu Qianyun suddenly reached out and grabbed her wrist. Chapter 8: Punishment from the Foster Father. Jiang Luzi had no time to react before she was pulled onto the sofa by her adoptive father's fierce force. Fu Qianyun held her firmly under him, and his big hand attacked her slender neck. "Who gave you the courage to break up with Xiao Haozhou?" he shouted in a deep voice. Jiang Luzi's heart trembled. "Daddy, I..." Before she could finish her words, Fu Qianyun had already tightened his grip on her neck. Jiang Luzi's fair cheeks suddenly turned red. Shortness of breath. She instinctively grabbed her adoptive father's iron cage-like arm, trying to ask him to let go. "Did I warn you? This marriage is of vital importance to the Fu family." Fu Qianyun's brows were filled with gloom, and he gritted his teeth and uttered these words. Their violent emotions are out of control. He paused only for a moment, then increased his strength again, clenching his 5 fingers tightly. Jiang Luzi only felt that the chill from her adoptive father was getting heavier and heavier. The strength of his men became more and more brutal. The air in her chest was squeezed out of her. If this continues, she will suffocate to death. Since childhood, he always wanted to torture her to death. Just because she was her mother's child with another man, she was proof of betrayal. It seemed that only by killing her could Fu Qianyun eliminate the hatred in his heart. Fu Qianyun watched as Jiang Luzi's breathing became weaker and weaker, and her pupils became more and more dilated. It seemed that if he didn't let go, she would really go find her mother. Suddenly, he loosened his hand abruptly. But his eyes were darker than the night outside. His hands clenched tightly as if he was restraining something. Cough, cough, cough. Jiang Luzi covered her neck, breathed heavily, and coughed desperately. Just now she was almost strangled to death by her adoptive father. This was not the first time Fu Qianyun wanted to strangle her since his mother's death. It's a miracle that she is still alive today. Suddenly, Fu Qianyun's clenched hand reached out to her again. "Daddy." Jiang Luzi's heart started to panic and she looked at him in horror. I thought Fu Qianyun wanted to strangle her like he did just now. Unexpectedly, he just reached out and touched her slender neck. "Look, there are red marks again." There was tenderness in his voice. His eyes were dark and sharp. Jiang Luzi's skin was naturally fair and tender, and every time he pinched it, it would leave a mark. But when Fu Qianyun saw the glaring red marks on her fair skin, he enjoyed it instead. Jiang Luzi was trembling all over. There was a deep sense of defensiveness in his eyes. Her adoptive father's temperament changed drastically since her mother passed away. He is often moody and even a little abnormal. He can be gentle one second and cruel the next. Jiang Luzi subconsciously clutched the sofa beneath her and had to be extremely alert. I wonder if my adoptive father will turn back into his devilish appearance in the next second. "Cici, are you always disobedient? Haven't you learned your lesson yet?" Fu Qianyun's originally gentle and elegant face exuded a cold and cruel expression, and his tone rose sinisterly. Jiang Luzi trembled physically and mentally. "Daddy, I always listened to you." She knew very well that if she didn't give in at this time she would be courting death. Fu Qianyun grasped her chin with his long fingers and looked into her eyes very closely. "Be obedient. Then why didn't you come back last night when I asked you to?" His voice was as cold as a pond and full of doubt. "I already..." Jiang Luzi defended instinctively. He froze suddenly in the middle of his words. It wasn't that she didn't listen to her adoptive father last night. Even though she was sore all over, she still rushed back overnight. But when she came back, she happened to see her adoptive father and her best friend making love on the sofa. Jiang Luzi really didn't want to disturb her, so she turned around and left. What happened to you last night? Fu Chenyan stared at her closely with a deep gaze. Jiang Luzi's red lips stiffened. It was really hard to talk about the scene she saw last night. I could only bite the bullet and apologize. I'm sorry, Daddy, I drank too much last night and overslept. There was a moment of stalemate in the atmosphere. The light circulating around adoptive father Fu Chenyan suddenly flashed with a cold light as cold as a blade. He looked like a ghost. A deadly cold aura emanated from his body. This breath flowed into her skin little by little, seeped into her blood, and spread throughout her body. It was as if her entire body was completely frozen. I can let go of what happened last night. But Fu Chenyan narrowed his cold eyes, and his slender hands continued to linger around her fair neck, as if he was ready to strangle her throat at any time. He looked gloomy and cold, and glanced at her coldly, and suddenly changed the subject. The Fu family needs the Chiao family's funds. Jiang Luzi almost couldn't catch her breath. His eyes were full of panic. Daddy. He wants to kill her or chop her up. Can he give her a quick death? This will only make her suffer more. Do you know what to do? Fu Chenyan stared at her with his murderous eyes and spoke in a low voice. At the same time, his long fingers snaked down her slender neck, his movements ambiguous and ghostly. Jiang Luzi's whole body was shaking with fear. I know. She held her breath and said hurriedly. What her adoptive father meant was that he did not agree with her breaking up with Xiao Haizhou. He wants the marriage between their two families to continue. Fu Chenyan smiled with satisfaction, like a devilish. Be good and listen, you will always be the eldest daughter of the Fu family. His handsome face was gloomy and uncertain, and he became more and more threatening. After saying that, he finally let her go, stood up and left. The cold voice kept lingering in Jiang Luzi's ears like a spell. Jiang Luzi's body felt as heavy as if it were filled with lead. I want to climb but I can't. She knew that Fu Chenyan's last sentence was both a warning and a threat. She, the eldest daughter of the Fu family, was given everything by him. He could lift her to this position, but he could also make her fall down, badly. If she didn't follow his arrangement and marry into the Chiao family, he would have plenty of ways to punish her. She and Fu Chenyan are just adoptive father and daughter, and have no blood relationship. From childhood to adulthood, if she dared to go against Fu Chenyan's wishes, he would never show mercy to her. If Jiang Luzi wants to protect herself, she naturally cannot openly reject Fu Chenyan's suggestion. I can only think of another way. Why don't you get up? Who are you lying here for? A familiar cold female voice came. Jiang Luzi suddenly came back to her senses and looked up. Not surprisingly, she saw the hateful face of her former best friend Zhuang Yichuan. This is Fu's house. Is it your business if I lie down as long as I want? She sat up slowly and glanced at Zhuang Yichuan disapprovingly. You still know that this is the Fu residence? Is your last name Fu? Zhuang Yichuan sneered mockingly. Jiang Luzi retorted sarcastically, you make it sound like your last name is Fu. My last name is not Fu, but I am now married to someone with the last name Fu, so I am the legitimate Mrs. Fu of the Fu family. Zhuang Yichuan raised his chin proudly and taunted maliciously, unlike some people, who have been hiding from their mother all their lives. Bang! Chapter 9. Did she offend him? Before she could finish her words, Jiang Luzi slapped her in the face without any hesitation. No matter how much Zhuang Yichuan mocked her, she could endure it. But not when it comes to her mother. You dare to hit me? Zhuang Yichuan widened his eyes and shouted in disbelief. I'll hit you if I want to. What's there to be afraid of? Jiang Luzi met her gaze fearlessly. Zhuang Yichuan threatened fiercely, do you believe me? I will tell your adoptive father that you are committing a crime of insubordination. What have I done wrong? You? Do you really think you are nothing in the eyes of my adoptive father? Jiang Luzi sneered disdainfully, if he knew that you had the guts to humiliate my mother just now, I'm afraid he would be the first one to teach you a lesson. A trace of jealousy flashed across Zhuang Yichuan's eyes. Your mother has been dead for a long time, and the current Mrs. Fu is me, Zhuang Yichuan. She said this and approached her insidiously. Did you see how your adoptive father loved me last night? Sooner or later, I will replace your mother in his heart. The curve of Jiang Luzi's mouth widened and she couldn't help but roll her eyes. To be honest, I admire you a lot. You can even eat a man as old as my adoptive father. After all, her adoptive father is nearly 60 years old. Even if he takes good care of himself, he only looks like a middle-aged man in his 40s or 50s. But there is an age gap of nearly 30 years between him and Zhuang Yichuan. He can definitely be Zhuang Yichuan's father. But Zhuang Yichuan actually did everything she could to marry him. Try your best to please him. In order to get her to marry her adoptive father, she even plotted against her best friend. She served an old man 30 years older than her so hard last night, and she was actually quite proud of herself. Zhuang Yichuan's expression changed again and again. She gritted her teeth and said calmly, "I just like mature men like your adoptive father. Is it your business?" Jiang Luzi exposed her bluntly, "Do you really like my adoptive father? Or do you like the identity of Mrs. Fu?" If Zhuang Yichuan married into the Fu family because she really loved her adoptive father, how could she have cheated on him behind his back? After all, she was attracted by Mrs. Fu's identity. Zhuang Yichuan's true thoughts were exposed by her words, and he couldn't help but look a little embarrassed. She glared at her hatefully, "Jiang Luzi, just wait. Sooner or later, I will let your adoptive father kick you out of the Fu family." Jiang Luzi sneered in her heart. Does Zhuang Yichuan think that everyone is like her, so eager to enter the Fu family? She and her mother had tried every possible way to escape from the cage of the Fu family, but they never had a chance. Only a woman like Zhuang Yichuan would be willing to marry into the family. Then you'll have to endure the hardship and climb onto my adoptive father's bed a few more times. Jiang Luzi laughed mockingly. After saying that, he ignored her and got up and left. Zhuang Yichuan was left standing there alone, stamping his feet in resentment and anger, and was extremely angry. The next day, Jiang Luzi arrived at the company and manager Chen Yuan immediately called her to the office. "Did you offend President Zhang yesterday?" Chen Yuan asked as soon as she saw her. Jiang Luzi's heart sank. "What's wrong? We haven't been able to contact President Zhang's secretary since yesterday," Chen Yuan said with an anxious frown. Although she knew in her heart that the possibility of Zhang family investing in their project was very slim. But yesterday she personally took Jiang Luzi to meet Zhang Xiao, and unexpectedly discovered that Zhang Xiao seemed to have some interest in Jiang Luzi. She seemed to see a glimmer of hope. But this glimmer of hope only lasted until this morning. After Zhang continued to maintain an indifferent attitude, she seemed to face the reality. "But I feel a little unwilling in my heart." Only then did he call Jiang Luzi to the office for questioning. "How did you introduce it to President Zhang yesterday?" Chen Yuan looked her straight in the eye and asked. Jiang Luzi replied seriously, "According to your wishes, I have introduced everything that needs to be introduced." She made sure that she had clearly introduced their company's project contract in all aspects without missing a word in Zhang Xiao's luxury car. Even some details are intentionally beautified. However, Zhang Xiao never expressed his opinion. He was mysterious and frugal with words. She couldn't guess what he meant. "And then?" Chen Yuan continued to ask. "Then what?" Jiang Luzi blinked. "Besides introducing our project contract to President Zhang, did you do anything else?" Chen Yuan indicated with her eyes. "I was so anxious that I almost asked her directly if Zhang Xiao had taken advantage of me because of this. Although this possibility is unlikely. But Jiang Luzi is so beautiful that it is possible that even a hero in wartime would be unable to resist the temptation of beauty." Sure enough, Jiang Luzi nodded, "Yes." Chen Yuan was immediately overjoyed. "What is it?" "I went to the golf course with President Zhang." Jiang Luzi told the truth. Chen Yuan's eyes lit up. "You played golf with President Zhang. What does it mean that Yao can take her to play golf during the war?" "This means Jiang Luzi has a chance. Proves that she was right. But I don't know how to fight, so I came back alone." Jiang Luzi shrugged again. Chen Yuan's eyes almost popped out of her head. How could you come back alone?" She couldn't believe it. Such a golden opportunity, yet she missed it. Jiang Luzi. What else can she do if she doesn't come back alone? Sitting there in a daze on the golf course. Didn't Yao Mingming leave her alone during the war? Chen Yuan's forehead was full of black lines. "I just feel that this newcomer, Jiang Luzi, is too dull. This needs to be carefully mentioned. Come with me tonight to a drinking party, and I will personally teach you how to sell." Chen Yuan shook her head and sighed, then finally gave her instructions. Jiang Luzi could only nod and agree. In the evening, with the purpose of studying, she went to a high-end club, De Hao, with her manager Chen Yuan. This is one of the top clubs in City A, and the guests received here are either rich or noble. Jiang Luzi deliberately wore a formal and solemn outfit to show her importance of tonight's drinking party. As a result, when Chen Yuan saw her dressed like this, she immediately criticized her and even took her to the mall to buy her a sexy low-cut red dress. When Jiang Luzi put it on, she was truly stunning. The deep V-cut design outlines her graceful body curves, making her look like a sexy beauty, enough to catch people's attention. Only then did Chen Yuan lead her into the club with satisfaction. As soon as they walked in, they saw a man surrounded by a crowd of people. The man was wearing a neat black handmade suit, which outlined his tall and slender figure. His steps were fast but not chaotic, and he exuded a powerful and noble aura. The handsome face with sharp edges could not be clearly seen in the alternating light and dark. But Jiang Luzi still recognized him at a glance. Wartime glory. Jiang Luzi was shocked. I didn't expect to run into him here. Jiang Luzi's subconscious reaction was to lower her head like an ostrich and pretend not to see him. As a result, the manager Chen Yuan beside her actually took the initiative to greet Zhang Xiang, Boss Zhang. Chapter 10. You even dare to snatch his woman. In response to manager Chen Yuan's respectful and enthusiastic greetings, Zhang Xiao simply glanced in their direction. His eyes were cold and distant, as if he was treating a stranger. He exuded an inhuman coldness. Jiang Luzi lowered her head, not daring to look him in the eye out of guilt. But I can still feel the strong sense of oppression from him. Zhang Xiao walked past them indifferently. It was as if he didn't see Jiang Luzi. But the men around him all noticed her. Who was that beautiful lady just now? She was so hot. I think his name is Jiang Sai. So beautiful. The one with big breasts and thin waist, I wonder if she is in bed. Zhang Xiao frowned even more tightly as he listened to the men's discussions. Suddenly he stopped and gave the men a very intimidating look. These people were so frightened that they fell silent instantly. Zhang Xiao's deep gaze swept over to Jiang Luzi, who was wearing a red dress. Jiang Luzi has already followed manager Chen Yuan towards the elevator. However, she always felt a sharp gaze staring at her, making her feel like needles were pricking her back. At tonight's drinking party, manager Chen Yuan took her to socialize with Mr. Zhao, a bald old man over 50 years old. In the luxurious box, Mr. Zhao raised his glass to her repeatedly and said enthusiastically, "Miss Jiang, come on, let's have another drink." At the signal from manager Chen Yuan, Jiang Luzi had to pick up the wine glass in front of her again. She forced a smile and touched him from a distance. Another glass of wine. The spicy wine slid down my throat into my stomach, causing an intense burning sensation. Jiang Luzi couldn't help but frown. Even though she had just entered the workplace, she already felt that sales was not an easy job. Especially when you meet a client like Mr. Zhao, who is both old and lustful. He had already made her drink several glasses of wine tonight, but Mr. Zhao just refused to talk about business. Manager Chen Yuan, who was standing by, saw that she had already drunk a lot and couldn't drink any more. He quickly took out the contract that he had prepared long ago. "Mr. Zhao, you see that our Lucai is so sincere when meeting you for the first time today, and drank so many cups at once. Will you also sign the contract with us quickly?" "No problem signing the contract." Mr. Zhao took the pen readily, but his lustful eyes fell on Jiang Luzi's pretty face. "But I want Miss Jiang to sing a song with me alone." Jiang Luzi frowned at Mr. Zhao's request. There was a hint of vigilance in his eyes. Mr. Zhao actually asked her to accompany him alone? Could it be as simple as singing a song? Manager Chen Yuan hesitated for a moment. But in order to sign the contract smoothly, she could only wink at Jiang Luzi again. "It's just singing, Cici, why don't you sing a song with Mr. Zhao?" "I'm going to the bathroom." She specifically said she was going to the bathroom, not leaving. "I just want to warn Mr. Zhao that she is still here, so it's okay to take advantage of her, but don't really bully the newcomer she brought here." After all, Chen Yuan still wanted to keep Jiang Luzi to hook up with Zhang Xiao and get a bigger contract. "I just wanted to bring her out tonight to see the world and give her some advice, but I don't want her to be really corrupted by this Mr. Zhao." But Chen Yuan didn't expect that as soon as she left the box, Mr. Zhao couldn't wait to hug Jiang Luzi's slender waist. "Miss Jiang, you smell so good." He greedily moved closer to Jiang Luzi's neck and took a deep sniff. The old man's eye sparkled. How about we sing a love song together? Mr. Zhao, please don't worry. Let's sign this contract and I will sing love songs with you. Jiang Luzi withdrew from his arms without leaving a trace, picked up the contract and handed it to him. She didn't want the old man to go back on his word after she finished singing, or make other requests to make things difficult for her. So the real thing is to coax him into signing the contract first. Unexpectedly, Mr. Zhao pounced on her and pushed her down on the sofa in the box. It doesn't matter whether you sing or not, but after signing the contract, Miss Jiang, you have to accompany me to get a room. His dirty hands touched Jiang Luzi's skin, and his pair of thieving eyes emitted an obscene and lustful light. Jiang Luzi was covered in goosebumps. I almost vomited out of disgust. She had long seen that the old man had ill intentions. What about singing a song with her alone? It was clearly an excuse to transfer Manager Chen away so that he could take advantage of her. This time he even directly proposed to her the unreasonable idea of booking a room with her. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Zhao, but I'm still a newcomer and I'm afraid I can't serve you well. Jiang Luzi tried hard to keep smiling and declined politely. But Mr. Zhao ignored the rejection in her tone and went even further, placing his greasy big hand on her thigh. I'd just like to train newcomers. If Miss Jiang is willing to follow me, I guarantee that you will be able to take the position of Manager Chen within half a year. How about it? Mr. Zhao coaxed with deep meaning. As he spoke, his fat hand slowly slid into her skirt. Jiang Luzi simply couldn't bear it anymore. Mr. Zhao, please respect yourself. She pushed him away angrily and warned. Self-respect. Mr. Zhao smiled coldly, and seeing that temptation failed, he simply threatened. Ms. Jiang, do you know that if you offend me, I can make you unable to continue in this line of work with just one word? He deliberately pulled a long face and scared her. Jiang Luzi gritted her teeth and clenched her hands into fists unconsciously. Mr. Zhao thought his trick worked. Jiang Luzi was like many young girls who had just entered the workplace. He was frightened. He took the opportunity to rush over again and hugged her slender waist, and softened his tone. But don't worry, Miss Jiang, I, Zhao, have always been kind to women. As long as you obey me obediently, I promise that you will be successful in this industry in the future. Jiang Luzi snorted in her heart. I have to say that Mr. Zhao is very good at using both soft and hard tactics to deal with women. But I'm afraid he chose the wrong person tonight. Although she is also a newcomer in the sales industry, it does not mean that she must be controlled by him. Besides, there are many people who want to make her fail, so who does he think he is? Boss Zhao, have you ever heard of Zhang Xiao? Jiang Luzi suddenly raised her head and looked at him with a smile. Mr. Zhao's expression paused, and his small eyes narrowed slightly. How could he not have heard of Zhang Xiao's reputation? Not everyone can mess with that living devil. He was naturally afraid. But so what? It is said that although Zhang Xiao was a gangster, he was not interested in women. I'm his woman. Jiang Luzi actually said. Mr. Zhao looked unconvinced. Miss Jiang, are you kidding me? I have never heard of any woman around Mr. Zhang. Just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I got into his luxury car a few days ago and had sex with him. Jiang Luzi curled her red lips slightly, raised her eyebrows and asked back, could it be that Mr. Zhao dares to snatch Zhang Xiao's woman? Chapter 12. He named her tonight. He held her slender waist tightly. This posture is like embedding her in his arms. Spying on your fiancé cheating on you. Zhang Xiao narrowed his eyes slightly. I didn't expect Miss Jiang to have this habit. Jiang Luzi's pretty face changed again and again. Both embarrassed and helpless. What's it to you? She couldn't help but put her hand against his chest, trying to push him away. But Zhang Xiao was already taller than her, with a tall and strong build. How could she push it away just because she wanted to? You were the one who provoked me first. Zhang Xiao lowered his head and bit her earlobe. The voice is ambiguous and hoarse. Jiang Luzi felt a sudden inspiration all over her body. Her ears are her most sensitive part. Being alone in a suite with Zhang Xiao at this moment, Jiang Luzi felt extremely dangerous. She just wanted to leave quickly. Boss Zhang, please let me go first. No. What do you want? She asked helplessly. At this moment, when Zhang Xiao lowered his head, he could see the fine soft velvet and the faint blush on her delicate face. He couldn't help but think of that night at the banquet when she suddenly stumbled over to him, her eyes blurry and her pretty face flushed. "Be my woman." He suddenly grabbed her slender waist and pressed her towards him. To put it simply, it is irresistible. The burning gaze aimed at her red lips and was about to invade. But Jiang Luzi instinctively avoided it. "No." A cold light flashed in Zhansha's dazzling eyes. "You dare to refuse?" His tone was intimidating. It seemed that he didn't expect that she would refuse without hesitation. "Mr. Zhan, stop joking." Jiang Luzi tried hard to force a smile. "You think I'm joking with you?" Zhan Xiaojun's face was dark, and his dark eyes contained a layer of complex emotions that she couldn't understand. Jiang Luzi's red lips trembled. "I already have a fiancé." Zhan Xiao frowned and looked at her with eyes like a bottomless cold pond. Didn't they break up already? He clearly remembered that she had called Xiao Haizhou to break up with him in the golf locker room. Jiang Luzi smiled bitterly. He didn't agree. Otherwise, why would she come here to secretly take pictures to get evidence of his cheating? She just wanted to find something to hold against Xiao Haizhou so that she could break off the engagement with him. Zhan Xiao narrowed his deep and bottomless eyes slightly, as if he understood something in an instant. "I'll help you." He pursed his lips tightly and suddenly looked at her. Jiang Luzi was stunned. Something flashed across her beautiful eyes. "I dare not trouble you, President Zhan." She naturally knew that with Zhan Xia's help, everything would definitely go much more smoothly. But there is no free lunch in the world. She didn't want to get out of the wolf's den with great difficulty only to fall into the tiger's den again. "Are you reluctant to cancel the engagement?" Zhan Xia's eyes were cold and gleaming. His tall body pressed tightly against her again. Jiang Luzi was originally trapped between his hard chest and the cold door. At this moment, his pressure made her chest hurt and she had difficulty breathing. She subconsciously reached out and pushed his chest. I could clearly feel his hot body temperature and strong heartbeat at this moment. Cold sweat oozed from Jiang Luzi's palms. "Boss Zhan, this seems to be my personal matter." The implication was that she didn't want him to meddle in her affairs anymore. Zhan Xia's already gloomy face instantly became even uglier. The look in her eyes gradually became deeper and deeper. Sharp and cold. Jiang Luzi's scalp numbed and she felt an unprecedented sense of oppression. She instinctively wanted to break free from his arms. But the next second, Zhan Xiao suddenly grabbed her jaw. The thin lips pressed directly against her. Jiang Luzi widened her eyes slightly and looked at the man who was so close to her in disbelief. He actually kissed her forcefully. His kiss was fierce, as if he was punishing her. Jiang Luzi's mind went blank for a few seconds. When she came to her senses and wanted to resist, he took the opportunity to pry open her teeth and forcefully penetrated. It took her breath away in an instant. Jiang Luzi was both embarrassed and annoyed, impatiently trying to push her away. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake him at all. Instead, he kissed me so hard that my whole body went limp and my brain was deprived of oxygen. Jiang Luzi was trembling all over and her pretty face was flushed. I couldn't push him away, but I didn't want to be kissed by him anymore. In a hurry, she suddenly put her arms around his neck and responded to him awkwardly. Zhan Xia's body stiffened slightly, as if he didn't expect her to cooperate suddenly. Just when he was stunned, Jiang Luzi suddenly raised her leg and attacked some vulnerable part of his body. She really showed no mercy. Gave him a heavy blow. Zhan Xia's handsome face suddenly became a little more ferocious. He frowned in pain. Jiang Luzi took this opportunity and quickly pushed him away. He opened the door and ran out. She did it almost in one go. After leaving the room, he went straight downstairs. She ran as fast as she could, as if some ferocious beast was chasing her. As a result, he was not careful, sprained his ankle and fell to the ground. Jiang Luzi didn't even cry out in pain. She got up. "Come and run downstairs again." Finally ran out of the club. She urgently hailed a taxi and fled back to her small apartment. It was not until she lay back on the bed that her troubled heart finally calmed down. As if realizing he was safe, Jiang Luzi breathed a sigh of relief and wiped the cold sweat from her forehead. But the next second, when she realized something, she quickly sat up from the bed in shock. She just seemed to have kicked Zhan Xiao. Sky. What's wrong with her? Jiang Luzi realized it belatedly and was immediately annoyed. Who gave her the courage to kick Zhan Xiao? What if he takes revenge on her? Now Xiao Haozhou is enough to give her a headache. If she makes another powerful enemy like Zhang Xiao, will she be able to survive in the future? Besides, Yao was not Xiao Haozhou during the war. If he wanted to kill her, it would definitely be easier than crushing an ant. Jiang Luzi regretted that she was too impulsive at that time. But now it's too late. Jiang Luzi was worried and almost didn't sleep all night. The next day she went to the company with big dark circles under her eyes. Prepared for the worst. After all, she had offended Zhang Xiao, and she could lose her job at any time. If you just get scolded by the manager, that would be the lightest consequence. What Jiang Luzi never expected was that manager Chen Yuan actually greeted her with a smile when she saw her. "Lu Sai, I have good news for you. President Zhang finally agreed to give our company a chance." Jiang Luzi was shocked. Is this possible? Doesn't that mean Zhang Xiao wasn't angry last night? Just business as usual? President Zhang has specifically asked for you to join us for the dinner tonight. Chen Yuan looked at her with a smile. Jiang Luzi's eyelids jumped when she heard that. Sure enough, she said, how could such a good thing happen in the world? It turned out that Zhang Xiao wanted to punish her during tonight's social event. How could she give him this chance? Manager, I feel a little uncomfortable at night and want to take a leave. Jiang Luzi hurriedly made an excuse. Chapter 13, asking her to toast him. Chen Yuan's face immediately turned serious. Lu Sai, President Zhang specifically asked you to come over tonight. If you don't show up, it will be difficult for me and the boss to explain it. But Jiang Luzi looked embarrassed. Chen Yuan pointed out meaningfully, Lu Sai, I am very optimistic about you. If you can win over President Zhang, you will definitely be the sales star of our department this year. Although Jiang Luzi really wanted to win the honor of sales star, she wanted to save her life more. But no matter what she said, manager Chen Yuan insisted that she attend the dinner in the evening to meet Zhang Xiao. In desperation, she could only risk her life. Lu Sai, what's wrong with you? The manager is willing to take you to meet Zhang Xiao in the evening, but you are not happy. Luo Xiaoran couldn't help but show concern when she saw her sad face. Jiang Luzi held her chin helplessly. I just don't want to go. Luo Xiaoran was stunned. Everyone in our department is scrambling to go, and now the manager has given you such a good opportunity, and you don't want to go. Do you want to go? Or you can go on my behalf. Jiang Luzi looked up at her. Luo Xiaoran shrugged. I would like to, but I'm not as pretty as you, and the manager doesn't like my looks. Jiang Luzi sighed, feeling distressed. Colleagues in the sales department, especially the female ones, were jealous and envied her for having such a good opportunity. In fact, she really wanted to give this opportunity to someone else. God knows she just kicked Zhang Xiao last night, and it was in such a vital part. If I go to see him tonight, wouldn't that be courting death? No matter how reluctant she was, Jiang Luzi was still taken to a nearby fashion store by her manager Chen Yuan to dress up after work. The fabric that manager Chen selected for her this time was almost even less than last time. Black deep V miniskirt. Jiang Luzi looked at herself in the mirror, lowered her head and pulled at the hem of her skirt, which couldn't be any shorter. As a result, she accidentally exposed her breasts. She quickly covered it with her hands. This skirt is really hard to describe. As a result, manager Chen Yuan was actually very satisfied. I bet President Zhang will like it. The corners of Jiang Luzi's mouth twitched greatly. Why did she feel that the manager was going to sell her to Zhang Xiao? Do I have to dress like this to work in sales? She couldn't help but ask. Chen Yuan said seriously, to be a salesperson, you must know how to play to your strengths, and your strengths. She didn't say what she said next. But the clear implication is that Jiang Luzi should make good use of the advantages of her face and figure. Expand your sales customer channels. This is the unspoken rule of the workplace. Jiang Luzi understood. However, a man of Zhang Xiao's status and position should have seen many women like this and actively seduced them. Is it really okay for her to do this? It won't backfire. When she followed her manager Chen Yuan to their hotel box for tonight's social gathering, the boss Wang Han and Zhang Xiao had already arrived. When the boss saw Chen Yuan bringing Jiang Luzi over, his eyes lit up. He immediately pointed to the seat to Zhang Xiao's left and called her, come and sit over here. Jiang Luzi was pushed to Zhang Xiao's side by Chen Yuan. Before sitting down, she politely greeted Zhang Xiao, hello, President Zhang. Zhang Xiao raised his eyes and glanced at her lightly. His handsome facial features were exceptionally cold and distant. Jiang Luzi felt as if someone was strangling her throat when he stared at her. At that moment, even breathing became extremely difficult. The atmosphere suddenly became cold and stiff. Mr. Wang smiled and introduced, "Mr. Zhang, this is the beauty from our company's sales department, Jiang Luzi." Zhang Xiao finally snorted in response. But the gaze that fell on Jiang Luzi at this moment was so deep that it seemed to be able to burn a hole in her. When Mr. Wang saw this, he quickly winked at Jiang Luzi. Jiang Luzi understood instantly. She gritted her teeth, pretended nothing had happened, and held out her hand to him with a smile. "Boss Zhang, please take care of me in the future." She wanted to take the initiative to show her goodwill to Zhang Xiao. Let him forgive her recklessness last night for now. Unexpectedly, Zhang Xiao didn't give her any way out. "Sorry, I'm a germaphobe." He raised his chin arrogantly, turned his head and didn't look at her again. Jiang Luzi froze in place instantly. It's as embarrassing as it can be. Everyone in the box looked at her strangely. Jiang Luzi gritted her teeth and still tried hard to maintain a smile on her face. "It doesn't matter." In full view of everyone, she calmly withdrew her slender hand that she had just extended. It's not shameful to be rejected by a big shot like Zhang Xiao. Boss Wang Han couldn't help but glance at the manager Chen Yuan behind her. The look in his eyes seemed to be questioning whether she was the person that Zhang Xiao had specifically requested to accompany him tonight. "I thought President Zhang was interested in this new beauty in their sales department. Now looking at it, doesn't he seem like it? If President Zhang was really interested in Jiang Luzi, why would he embarrass her in public?" Mr. Wang and Chen Yuan were both puzzled. However, since Jiang Luzi had been pushed to the position next to Zhang Xiao, she could only bear the pressure and sit down. The drinking party started soon. Everyone started talking about some formalities. Various kinds of food and drinks were served one after another. Jiang Luzi didn't dare to eat too much. She chewed slowly and elegantly. When others were talking, she just listened quietly, kept smiling, and never interrupted. And beside her, Zhang Xiao seemed to have no interest in her existence at all. "It's almost like I don't know her anymore." "That's better." Jiang Luzi wished that he would even forget how she kicked him last night. Even though she knew in her heart that it was unlikely. Everyone at the table was vying to curry favor with him and toasting him. He always sat in a high position, keeping calm. Even when their CEO Wang tried to get to the point several times and wanted to talk to him about the investment in their company's project, he did not express his opinion. A black handmade suit outlines his strong and upright figure. It also highlights his noble aura and awe-inspiring power. It always gives people a feeling of being high and mighty and difficult to approach. Mr. Wang is really at his wit's end. Seeing this, manager Chen Yuan moved closer to Jiang Luzi. She lowered her voice and said, "Go and toast Mr. Zhang. I always feel that he is not very happy tonight, and it seems that he has a prejudice against you. After all, Chen Yuan has been working in sales for many years, so she has this insight." She sensitively realized that Zhang Xiao's unhappiness tonight came from Jiang Luzi, who was beside her. Mr. Wang and other people in their company also suffered. Halfway through the drinking session, Zhang Xiao hadn't expressed his opinion at all about cooperating with their company. Jiang Luzi nodded helplessly. Since she came to this dinner with manager Chen Yuan, it was her responsibility to coax Zhang Xiao. He is now the person their boss values the most. Jiang Luzi had no choice but to pick up the red wine glass in front of her, stood up and raised it towards Zhang Xiao. "Boss Zhang, I toast you a glass." Chapter 14. He sent her home. She smiled at him again. During the war, Yao still had a cold face. His eyes were cold and indifferent. Why? His eyes were full of oppression. Jiang Luzi took a breath of cold air without leaving a trace. "I have to admit that this man's aura is really too strong. Just think of it as making friends." She smiled even more brightly. Her charming and sunny smile is her most powerful weapon over the years. Friend. During the war, Yao Jian raised his eyebrows slightly, and a hint of sneer flashed across his cold lips. "That depends on whether Miss Jiang is qualified to be my friend." After he said that, he elegantly picked up a bottle of Moutai on the table and placed it in front of Jiang Luzi. Ms. Jiang's sincerity is all here. Zhang Xiao's dark pupils were deep and dark, as if he could see through her soul at a glance. There was no extra expression on Jun's face, it was still calm. But the meaning is very clear, how much she drinks reflects her sincerity. Jiang Luzi was stunned. Her watery eyes flickered with a hint of surprise. I didn't expect him to ask her to drink baijiu. Or Mao Tai. After drinking this bottle, even a grown man would feel nauseous. What's more, it's her. But Jiang Luzi reacted quickly. Zhang Xiao was clearly making things difficult for himself. Who told her to offend him last night? If she didn't drink the wine, she would be openly disrespecting him. Then he naturally can choose not to invest in their company's project. She can forget about working in this company anymore. So her career and this project of their company now all depend on her drinking capacity. Manager Chen Yuan and CEO Wang Han were also anxious after hearing Zhang Xiao's request. But he was helpless and didn't dare to stop it. It's just an accident. Why would Mr. Zhang, who is always such a gentleman, embarrass a girl tonight? Could it be that President Zhang has a grudge against Jiang Luzi? He specifically asked her to come over tonight to accompany him. Was he not interested in her? Was he trying to embarrass her? CEO Wang Han increasingly felt that this possibility was greater. I feel a little regretful that I asked Chen Yuan to bring Jiang Luzi here. Now the future of their company's important project depends on this bottle of liquor. But looking at Jiang Luzi's frail and slender body, it doesn't look like she can drink much. Boss Zhang, I'll drink first as a sign of respect. Jiang Luzi suddenly gritted her teeth, walked forward, picked up the Mao Tai bottle, and raised her head. She drank the whole bottle of wine so generously. Everyone present was stunned. This is Mao Tai. Even grown men like them wouldn't dare to drink like that. The Mao Tai was very strong, pouring over her lips and tongue and burning her throat. It felt like being scraped by a razor blade, painful and spicy. Jiang Luzi's tears almost burst out at once because of the burning sensation. Fortunately, this bottle of Mao Tai does not look that much. Most of it had already been drunk. The maximum amount of wine left is 1 glass. Despite this, after Jiang Luzi finished the rest of the Mao Tai, she staggered a few times and almost fell. Manager Chen Yuan came forward in time to help her. Are you okay? She couldn't help but ask worriedly. In fact, I still admire Jiang Luzi a little. She has trained many new people over the years. Many people were faced with this kind of situation and some even burst into tears when they were made to feel difficult. But Jiang Luzi didn't shed a single tear. So strong that it makes people feel distressed. She is so young, just a little girl. How could I know how to deal with such a situation? It's okay, I can still hold on. Jiang Luzi turned around and tried to smile at the manager. But in fact, the moment she put down the bottle, she was already dizzy and dazed. My stomach was churning. It seems like I will vomit at any moment. But she tried her best to endure it. How could she vomit in this situation? She tried hard to look in the direction of Zhang Xiao. I can't see clearly at all. A dozen or so Zhang Xiao's gloomy and handsome faces kept swaying in front of her. The shaking made her even more dizzy. The whole person feels even more uncomfortable. She seems drunk. Manager Chen Yuan's voice sounded at the right time. I'm not drunk. Jiang Luzi waved her hands quickly. She shook her head hard, and everything in front of her became even more blurry. Lu Sai? Lu Sai. Chen Yuan patted her drunken red face and said helplessly to the boss and Zhang Xiao, she is really drunk. She said she was drunk, but actually she wanted to help Jiang Luzi. Let other people at the table not make things difficult for her. The boss Wang Han smiled awkwardly. Sorry, Mr. Zhang, Xiao Jiang is a newcomer and can't hold his liquor well. Mr. Zhang, how about I drink with you on her behalf? Chen Yuan took the initiative to say. Zhang Xiao pursed his lips and said nothing. His knowing eyes were fixed on Jiang Luzi without blinking. Chen Yuan thought he still wanted to make things difficult for Jiang Luzi. He quickly turned to Mr. Wang and said, looks like we need to find someone to send Xiao Jiang back first. Boss Wang Han frowned. He didn't dare to offend Zhang Xiao, so he respectfully asked for his opinion. Boss Zhang, look at this. During the war, Yao Jun's face was deep and complicated, making it difficult to discern his emotions at the moment. His eyes were deep and dark. Her thin lips were kept tightly pursed. But suddenly he said, I'll take you there. Just a few simple words, yet they exude a strength that is hard to refuse. Everyone present was shocked. Before anyone could react, Zhang Xiao had already taken the staggering Jiang Luzi from Chen Yuan's hands. Everyone was shocked. Mr. Wang and Chen Yuan were even more puzzled. What exactly does Zhang Xiao mean by this? He just looked so cold and wanted to embarrass Jiang Luzi, but now he is rushing to send her home. I don't want you to send me off. Maybe because she drank too much, Jiang Luzi suddenly started to act like a spoiled brat. She didn't care what the occasion was, she only had one thought in her mind. She absolutely didn't want Zhang Xiao to send her back. She used her delicate hands to push Zhang Xiao's arms around her chest, wishing she could push him away. Zhang Xiao, go away. Everyone was shocked again. How dare this woman speak to President Zhang like this? Even if you're drunk, you can't act like this. Don't you want to live? Everyone seemed to have a premonition of Jiang Luzi's tragic fate. I thought Zhang Xiao would definitely punish her severely. Mr. Zhang was kind enough to send her home, but she dared to refuse. It's what you deserve for being so ungrateful. But what surprised everyone was, Zhang Xiao not only did not punish her again, but he picked her up by the waist in front of everyone. Behave yourself. He frowned and looked at her coldly with gritted teeth. Jiang Luzi pouted her red lips. Feeling the intimidation emanating from the man, she didn't dare to make trouble anymore. Zhang Xiao then hugged her and strode away. Everyone was speechless. Looking at Zhang Xiao's back as he walked away holding Jiang Luzi, I couldn't come back to my senses for a long time. Until their figures completely disappeared, their whole box seemed to be about to explode. Chapter 15. Vomiting on him in the luxury car. What are you doing? Let me go. After leaving the box, Jiang Luzi struggled all the way. Zhang Xiao not only did not let go, but instead held her waist even tighter. What do you think I can do to you? His voice was extremely cold, and his dark black eyes emitted a chilling and terrifying aura. Jiang Luzi's heart tightened. I could clearly feel myself trembling all over. But I don't know what I'm shaking about. Are you scared? Are you afraid of his changeable expression, or the unfathomable something in his eyes? Soon Zhang Xiao carried her out of the hotel. The night wind outside was very cold, and Jiang Luzi drank a lot of wine again. At this moment, the cold wind blew on my head, making me feel even more dizzy. The driver has already driven the Rolls-Royce luxury car over. Before she could struggle, Zhang Xiao had already carried her into the car. As soon as she got in the car, Jiang Luzi instinctively sat by the window to keep a distance from him. All the way in silence. The atmosphere in the car was quiet and almost depressing. Jiang Luzi was drunk at this time. Not only did she have a headache, but her stomach was also churning. Where do you live? Zhang Xiao suddenly asked her. Jiang Luzi pursed her red lips and couldn't answer him. As soon as she opened her mouth, she was about to vomit. I'm asking you, where do you live? Zhang Xiao turned sideways and asked again in a loud voice. Jiang Luzi suppressed the urge to vomit and was about to speak. Suddenly the driver made a sharp turn. Her body tilted and she fell towards Zhang Xiao unexpectedly. I fell headfirst into his legs, and luckily I hit him right where he was. After Jiang Luzi reacted, her pretty face suddenly turned red. Her whole person was instantly embarrassed to death. How come she? Jumping on me again. A man's cold and sarcastic voice sounded above my head. Jiang Luzi hurriedly explained, I am not. She really didn't mean to jump on him. After saying that, he was eager to get up. Unexpectedly, Zhang Xiao stretched out his big hand and grabbed her back. Since you like lying on me so much, just stay on for a while longer. The dangerous aura from him rushed towards her. Jiang Luzi's face was so red. How awful this man is. He deliberately used brute force to prevent her from getting up. The intention was to embarrass her to death. In a state of panic, Jiang Luzi's stomach churned even more. Vomit. She pointed at a certain part of his body and made a vomiting gesture. You dare to vomit. During the war, his eyes were dazzling and sharp, and his voice was a little darker. Jiang Luzi's body trembled. His intimidating look frightened her. Only. My stomach cramped. She couldn't control herself. With a puff sound, everyone in the car collapsed instantly. Zhang Xiao was still in shock, but the driver had already stopped the luxury car. He knew very well how misophobic their boss was. This woman was so bold as to vomit on boss. He would definitely throw her down. However, before Zhang Xiao could make any move, Jiang Luzi quickly opened the car door and rolled out of the car consciously. She rushed to the side of the road, squatted down, and started vomiting violently. I can't bear it at all. Her stomach was almost empty from all the vomit. My head is still dizzy. She frowned and clenched her collar tightly with both hands. Zhang Xiao saw how miserable she was, and even if he wanted to get angry, he couldn't. His eyes were gloomy. His eyebrows, eyes, lips and nose were all tinged with a hint of cold frost. I just stared at her like that, not knowing how long. Finally he pulled out a tissue and wiped the dirt off his body. He glanced at Jiang Luzi, who was squatting there, and almost vomited. Zhang Xiao pursed his lips and got out of the car. Because she had just vomited, Jiang Luzi's mind was much clearer. When she raised her head, she happened to meet a pair of dark and deep eyes. Their whole person was stunned. Did you finish vomiting? Zhang Xiao stared at her closely and asked. Hearing his low voice, Jiang Luzi reacted a little late. Just now in his luxury car, she seemed unable to hold back and vomited on him. Sorry. Jiang Luzi said apologetically. Zhang Xiao didn't say anything, his eyes were always on her. In front of them was a pool of filth, and even she found the smell pungent. But Zhang Xiao seemed not to smell it, and his deep gaze was always fixed on her face. Jiang Luzi felt uncomfortable being stared at by him. He gritted his teeth and stood up from the ground. He raised his head and glanced quickly at Zhang Xiao, then lowered his head again. The after effects of the alcohol have not completely worn off yet. Jiang Luzi had just been squatting for too long, and when she stood up suddenly, she inevitably felt dizzy. She shook it a few more times. Zhang Xiao reached out and helped her. Jiang Luzi was just about to thank him when he suddenly exerted force with his hands. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the car. Jiang Luzi had no strength in her body at this moment. There was no way to resist anymore, and he could only follow Zhang Xiao into his luxury car. After getting in the car, she stopped talking and just felt very tired, so tired that she didn't want to move at all. Finally I closed my eyes and fell asleep. The luxury car drove back onto the road. Zhang Xiao didn't ask Jiang Luzi where she lived. He just told the driver to find a luxury hotel to drop them off as soon as possible. There was still some stain of Jiang Luzi's vomit on his trousers. I simply can't stand it for a moment. You must take a shower and clean yourself up immediately. The driver quickly parked the luxury car in front of a 5-star hotel. Zhang Xiao tilted his head and glanced at Jiang Luzi. Prepare to ask her to get out of the car. Then I saw that she had fallen asleep leaning against the back of the chair. Her head was tilted, her red lips were slightly parted, her eyes were closed, and she seemed to be sleeping very soundly. Zhang Xiao's handsome face suddenly turned dark. This woman vomited all over him, but she was sleeping soundly. Open the window. He angrily ordered the driver to open the back seat window. Want to wake her up by freezing? But Jiang Luzi remained indifferent and slept even more soundly. Zhang Xiao frowned. This would be really annoying. Hey, get up. He leaned over and shouted in her ear. Jiang Luzi just snorted softly, turned over and went back to sleep. She drank half a bottle of Moutai. I vomited out my stomach again. How can I wake up at this moment? But when Jiang Luzi turned over, her pretty face happened to be facing Zhang Xiao. Their heads were almost touching. The smell of alcohol exhaled from Jiang Luzi's nostrils, mixed with the faint fragrance from her body, all sprayed on Zhang Xiao's face. The warm touch made him tense all over. And his dark gaze just happened to fall on her red lips, which were so close to her. Jiang Luzi's lips are very beautiful, slightly upturned and plump. She applied another layer of pink lip gloss, which made her look extremely seductive and charming. What if we kiss? Zhang Xiao naturally remembered the feeling they had in the luxury car that night. It was just that Jiang Luzi was eager to relieve the effects of the medicine in her body at the time, so their bodies communicated more. On the contrary, he didn't really feel what it was like to kiss her. Thinking about it now, my throat tightens. Zhang Xiao uncontrollably pressed towards that pink. Chapter 17. He falls in love with her body. Responsible. Jiang Luzi shuddered all over. I almost screamed out loud. How do you want me to be responsible? She took one look at his sharp, tense expression and couldn't help but ask. Be my woman. Jean Xiao's deep and dark gaze fell on her pretty red face. Ask again. Jiang Lu's chest vibrated slightly. Who would have thought that he was still thinking about making her his woman? Could it be that Mr. Jean has fallen in love with me? After a moment of silence, she raised her eyelashes slightly. Jean Xiao used his tall body to hold her against the door frame, supporting her head with his big hands. His eyes were dark and deep, like an abyss with no bottom. Do you think it's possible? Of course Jiang Luzi knew that this was impossible. How could he fall in love with her just by having sex with her once? She narrowed her eyes and sneered sarcastically, so you're in love with my body? Jean Xiao looked at her, his breath was hoarse. Your body smells really good. Jiang Luzi took a deep breath. Sure enough, men are animals who think with their lower body. He just wanted her body. I remember I rejected Mr. Jean last time. She calmed her breath and spoke to him as calmly as possible. Jean Xiao Jun's face suddenly darkened. He pursed his razor-thin lips and stared at her coldly. Are you sure you don't want to consider it again? Jiang Luzi shook her head without hesitation. No, Before she could finish her words, Jean Xiao suddenly grabbed her chin and kissed her. A wild and strong masculine scent rushed into her mouth. Jiang Lu's brain buzzed. My automatic reaction was to put my hands against his chest, trying to push him away. The palm of my hand touched a piece of warm skin. Jiang Luzi was surprised to find that the man was not wearing any clothes. At this moment, he was completely naked. Heartbeat, uncontrollable trembling. Her fair and delicate face was incredibly red. Jean Xiao was actually naked, pressed her against the door frame, and kissed her fiercely. Jiang Lu's lips felt numb. The nerves in my head were stretched as tight as strings. He was breathing heavier than ever. The hot breath sprinkled on her face and neck. An inexplicable throbbing and panic, along with the rapid flow of blood, hit every part of her body. Jiang Luzi knew very well that if she let him continue kissing her like this, she would get into trouble. Boss Jean, don't. She finally got the chance to open her mouth and shouted hurriedly. Jean Xiao's gloomy gaze swept across her blushing and timid face. You really don't want it. His hand slipped into her dress. Jiang Lu's eyes widened in surprise. As the dignified President Jean, you wouldn't force a woman. She clenched her fists and taunted with her lips impatiently. Jean Xiao frowned. He let her go the next second. The surroundings were suddenly filled with cold air. Jiang Luzi was overwhelmed by the cold air emanating from him, causing a layer of fine beads of sweat to appear on her forehead. Yao Jun's face looked extremely ugly during the war. He narrowed his eyes, and those eyes, which were slightly scarlet, seemed to flash with some violence and gloom. Jiang Luzi didn't even have time to push him away, as he grabbed her slender waist and kissed her fiercely. Jean Xiao pressed his thin lips against his again, with a hint of anger. He pried open her pearly teeth and swept through her wildly. Jiang Luzi felt as if her whole body was nailed to the door and she couldn't move. I don't know how long it took, but the strong, powerful, domineering and seductive masculine scent left. She blinked and was about to say something. There was a sudden pain in my lower lip. She tasted her own blood. But the man who bit her did not leave. Instead, he leaned close to her ear, his breath carrying a bit of rage and gloom. You provoked me, and you still want to deny it. Do you think I'm so easy to get rid of? Jiang Luzi was stunned. Boss Jean, Jean Xiao snorted coldly and held her earlobe in his mouth. I'll wait for you, be my woman voluntarily. It was already late when Jiang Luzi returned to her apartment. Thinking about Jean Xiao's last words in the hotel tonight, she was upset and couldn't fall asleep. How could she be willing to be his woman? But Jean Xiao was indeed right about one thing. She provoked him and now wants to deny it. She was worried because she knew he was difficult to deal with. She didn't want to sacrifice herself to Jean Xiao because of that accident. But if she didn't do this, she really couldn't afford to offend him. What should we do? Jiang Lu thought about it all night but still couldn't figure it out. The next day I woke up, washed up, and looked in the mirror. The red lips that were bitten by Jean Xiao last night have already scabbed over. But anyone with a discerning eye would know how she did it. Jiang Luzi cursed Jean Xiao fiercely in her heart. I went to work at the company with trepidation. She was afraid that someone would notice something strange on her red lips. As a result, as soon as she entered the sales office, she ran into Jiang. She was once recognized as the most beautiful woman in the sales department and the most beautiful woman in the entire company. However, since Jiang Luzi came, no one anymore said that Jiang was the most beautiful woman in their company. Sales manager Chen Yuan also clearly favored Jiang Luzi. All these opportunities were given to Jiang Luzi. Jiang had already felt unbalanced. When she saw the scab on Jiang Luzi's red lips, she immediately screamed. "Hey, Luz, what's wrong with your mouth?" Jiang shouted very loudly, as if she was afraid that others couldn't hear her. "Could it be that you were bitten by a man last night?" As soon as she said this, everyone in the office looked at her strangely. Jiang Luzi's cheeks flushed and she felt embarrassed for a moment. Why does everything you fear come true? The more she didn't want to be seen, the more she was seen by Jiang as soon as she entered the office. "I guess everyone in the company will know about this soon. It seems like you and your fiancé had a hot time last night." Seeing that she didn't say anything, Jiang continued to tease her meaningfully. Jiang Luzi just smiled perfunctorily and didn't make any excuses. When she first joined the company, several male colleagues showed their affection to her. At that time she had publicly announced that she already had a fiancé. So everyone in the company knew that she had a fiancé. Originally, if her lip was really bitten by her fiancé, it wouldn't be a big deal. But Jiang chased after her and deliberately asked, "But Lucai, didn't you go to Mr. Jean's dinner with the manager and the boss last night? Does your fiancé know?" The implication was that she suspected the scab on her lip was not caused by her fiancé biting her, hinting that she did something shameful at the dinner party. Jiang Luzi had to admit that Jiang had a very sharp sense of smell. She had indeed guessed it right. The scab on her lip was definitely not caused by the bite of her fiancé Qiao Haozhou. But what does this have to do with her? What obligation does she have to explain to Jiang? Jiang Luzi was about to retort when manager Chen Yuan came out of the office. Chen Yuan smiled as soon as she saw Jiang Luzi. "Luzi, congratulations." Chapter 18, Promotion. He came to pick her up after get off work. Congratulations to her for what? Jiang Luzi looked confused. Manager Chen Yuan walked up to her and said, "Congratulations on your promotion." After she finished speaking, she announced to the entire sales department, "From today on, Jiang Luzi will be promoted to team leader." Jiang Luzi was confused. Jiang, who was beside her, immediately looked unhappy. "Wasn't the original team leader Jiang?" someone questioned. Manager Chen Yuan didn't even look at Jiang. "Her performance has been poor recently, so she is replaced as team leader. Jiang Luzi will take over." Jiang's face turned pale. Her performance has been bad recently. But can she be blamed for this? She had no chance to meet big clients at all. Manager Chen Yuan has been extremely biased recently. All the good opportunities were given to Jiang Luzi. She even suspected that Chen Yuan had secretly received some benefits from Jiang Luzi. Otherwise, how could Jiang Luzi receive such treatment just after joining their sales department? It's only been a short time, and she, a newcomer, has been promoted to team leader? Manager, this is not good, right? I am still young. Jiang Luzi glanced at Jiang's face and took the initiative to speak to Chen Yuan. She knew she was just a newcomer. Getting promoted shortly after joining the sales department will not only make it difficult to convince others, but will also offend people. "Lucai, you did a great job. This is the reward you deserve." Chen Yuan looked at her with satisfaction. "Besides, this is what the boss wants, so don't refuse." Everyone else was shocked when they heard this. Jiang's eyes almost popped out. The boss actually promoted Jiang Luzi personally? Could it be that the boss has taken a fancy to her? Otherwise, how could she have been promoted so quickly? Jiang Luzi could only smile and thank him. "Thank you, manager and boss, for the promotion. I will work harder in the future." Chen Yuan glanced at the scab marks on her red lips and smiled ambiguously. "You have worked hard enough." She drank a bottle of Moutai in one breath last night, and President John personally sent her back. Isn't she working hard enough? After they left last night, CEO Wang Han almost couldn't stop laughing. It seems that their project of seeking total investment is a sure success. Jiang Luzi always felt that there was something behind the manager's words, but she didn't want to ask more. Then the manager said, "In order to reward your recent outstanding performance, the CEO has said that you will be the one to follow up on the follow-up cooperation with CEO Zhao on that project. All commissions and bonuses will belong to you alone. Jiang Luzi was shocked again. The rest of the sales department was completely stunned. When did their boss ever give such generous treatment? Jiang Luzi is definitely the first one. It turns out that being young and beautiful is your capital. The boss treats her differently. Jiangyi felt a sour feeling in her heart. I am so envious and jealous. Originally, she thought that she was the only one who could rely on her beauty to get to the top. Now the limelight that should have belonged to her was snatched away by Jiang Luzi. She couldn't help but feel angry and anxious. But there is nothing I can do. Who asked Jiang Luzi to be favored by the boss? Jiang Luzi once again expressed her gratitude to the manager for his kindness. And secretly vowed to achieve results. Make others take notice. Jiang Luzi was immersed in work all day and had no time to take care of other things. When it was almost time to get off work, Luo Xiaoran, who was working at the opposite workstation, suddenly leaned over. Lu Sai, how about we go eat hot pot together after get off work to celebrate your promotion? Luo Xiaoran invited with a smile. Jiang Luzi agreed without hesitation. Okay, but I'll treat you. The two began to pack up and prepare to go home. Jiang Luzi then glanced at her cell phone. She actually found that she had several missed calls, all from Xiao Haozhou. Jiang Luzi didn't want to pay any attention to him and simply chose to ignore him. Who would have thought that as soon as she and Luo Xiaoran walked out of the company gate, Xiao Haozhou's sports car drove in front of her. Get in the car. He rolled down the car window, revealing a familiar evil-looking handsome face. Jiang Luzi frowned instinctively and was about to refuse. Xiao Haozhou's eyes fell meaningfully on Luo Xiaoran, who was beside her. Would you like to introduce me? Jiang Luzi glared at him fiercely. She knew that he was threatening her in disguise. She concealed her identity as the daughter of the Fu family and came to Xingmao to apply for a job. Now, no one in the company, including Luo Xiaoran, who has the best relationship with her, knows her identity. I only heard that Jiang Luzi has a fiancé. Little did she know that her fiancé was the notorious second young master of the Qiao family, Xiao Haozhou. Xiao Haozhou asked her to introduce herself to him intentionally because he wanted to make their relationship and identities public. She got a sudden promotion today, and many colleagues in the company are already talking about her. If you knew that she was the daughter of the Fu family and her fiancé was the second young master of the Qiao family, how will she continue to work in the company in the future? Other colleagues will definitely look at her with tinted glasses. Jiang Luzi doesn't want to be treated specially. So she apologized and explained a few words to Luo Xiaoran beside her, then gritted her teeth and got into Xiao Haozhou's sports car. Where do you want to eat? Xiao Haozhou stepped on the accelerator and glanced at her with a smile on his face. Jiang Luzi had a blank expression on her face. Just send me home. Xiao Haozhou raised his thin lips. Do you want to cook for me yourself? Jiang Luzi suppressed the disgust in her heart. You think it's possible? She turned her head and taunted. She and Zhou Haozhou and his wife were originally just an engaged couple in name only. Both of them were tied together by a marriage contract from their respective families. In the past, when Xiao Haozhou was having affairs outside, Jiang Luzi could convince herself to turn a blind eye. But ever since she saw him having sex with her former best friend, now her stepmother, in the lounge, Jiang Luzi felt nauseous whenever she thought of him, let alone facing him now. She just wanted to get off the car immediately and cut off all ties with him. He also wants her to cook for him personally. It's simply impossible. What's impossible between us? Xiao Haozhou suddenly held her hand and looked at her evilly. Let go. Jiang Luzi's pupils shrank and she quickly pulled her hand back. But Xiao Haozhou actually held her hand tightly and wouldn't let go. What are you doing? Jiang Luzi was shocked. Even though they were engaged before, Xiao Haozhou, her nominal fiancé, had never been so touchy with her. Xiao Haozhou held her slender hand tightly and stroked it back and forth. There was a hint of an evil smile in his narrow eyes. You will be mine sooner or later, so why not just touch my hand? Who is your man? Jiang Luzi felt a chill in her heart and shouted angrily, I have already told you that we are breaking up. Xiao Haozhou asked her lightly, does your adoptive father agree? His eyes were mocking and his expression had a hint of teasing. It seemed as if she was certain that her adoptive father Fu Chenyun would definitely not agree. Jiang Luzi gritted her teeth and became even angrier. She did not forget that the last time she broke up with him, he reported the matter to her adoptive father and she was almost strangled to death. This is a matter between you and me, She had a cold face and was halfway through her words when Xiao Haizhou suddenly pulled her hand hard. Chapter 19. Want to break up? Go to bed with him first. Jiang Luzi's body had fallen into his arms. Xiao Haizhou was still driving at this time. Are you crazy? Let me go. She struggled in panic. Xiao Haizhou pushed her against the steering wheel with a crazy expression. Want to break up with me? Feed me first. After saying that, he started to tear off her skirt. Jiang Luzi hurriedly pushed him and said, no. Xiao Haizhou's eyes were sinister, and a hint of mockery appeared at the corner of his lips. I'm your fiancé, how dare you tell me no? Jiang Luzi looked unhappy. I don't know what medicine Xiao Haizhou took wrong today to treat her like this in the car. Although they had been engaged for a long time, Xiao Haizhou had never touched her even when he had affairs with other women outside. Who do you want? Your adoptive father Fu Qianyun. Xiao Haizhou suddenly approached her with an even more sarcastic smile. Jiang Luzi's pupils shrank. What nonsense are you talking about? It's really unfortunate for him to say such a thing. It's no longer a secret that you and your mother both Fu Qianyun's kept lovers. Xiao Haizhou sneered disdainfully. Jiang Luzi frowned. If you're talking about me, just talk about me. Don't bring up my mom. Her pretty face suddenly turned cold. The expression on Xiao Haizhou's forehead was covered with a terrible haze. So you admit it? He locked his eyes with her. Jiang Luzi was speechless. What did I admit? She strongly suspected that this man must have been instigated by her stepmother Zhuang Yichuan. With a squeak, Xiao Haizhou suddenly stepped on the brakes and stopped the car on the side of the road. He narrowed his eyes slightly, and suddenly said coldly, do you know why I haven't touched you all these years? Jiang Luzi. Xiao Haizhou looked at him mockingly, because I know that you are Fu Qianyun's man. Jiang Luzi's heart suddenly skipped a beat. So this is the reason. Ever since her mother died and her adoptive father adopted her, various speculations about their relationship have been circulating in high society. There were even rumors that she was being treated as a substitute for her mother and continued to be kept by Fu Qianyun. Jiang Luzi has always felt that this statement is extremely absurd. Unexpectedly, Xiao Haizhou believed it. But there was nothing wrong with him believing it, at least she escaped. Don't let him touch you. That old guy Fu Qianyun is so old, can he satisfy you? A sneer appeared on Xiao Haizhou's lips. There was a flash of anger in Jiang Luzi's eyes, but she didn't make any further excuses. Don't you want to break up with me? Go to bed with me. Xiao Haizhou stared at her with knowing eyes and suddenly spoke. Jiang Luzi turned to look at him in surprise. Xiao Haizhou smiled coldly, when I get tired of playing with you, I will let you go. His careless tone was like a huge rock, weighing heavily on her heart. Jiang Luzi immediately clenched her fists. I just felt that I was severely humiliated. Don't even think about it. She shouted through gritted teeth. Xiao Haizhou glanced at her with contempt. Don't pretend with me. It's better to accompany me than to accompany an old man like your adoptive father. Do you think I'm wronging you? His ruthless and sarcastic words pierced her heart like needles. Jiang Luzi sneered. Sorry, I feel so wronged. You? Xiao Haizhou stared at her with sharp eyes, as if he didn't expect her to refuse. The two people's eyes collided in the air. The atmosphere became tense. After a while, Xiao Haizhou suddenly let her go. You are so reluctant to agree. It seems that you still want to continue to be my fiancé. There was a sharp cold light in his eyes. Jiang Luzi's eyes were filled with hatred, and her red lips were tightly pursed into a straight line. Who the hell wants to continue being his fiancé? He just wanted her to sleep with him in order to break up with him. This is also absolutely impossible. As if he saw through her thoughts, Xiao Haizhou's handsome face suddenly turned gloomy. Get off me! He ordered coldly. He was so disgusted that he didn't want to look at her anymore. Jiang Luzi had wanted to leave him a long time ago. But he kept holding her waist. At this moment, he actually asked her to go down, which she just wanted more than anything. Jiang Luzi returned to the passenger seat before Xiao Haizhou started the car again and drove away. He just clenched the steering wheel with both hands, and the veins on the back of his hands throbbed, as if he was enduring something. The two of them were silent all the way. Until the car stopped in front of Jiang Lu's apartment. She immediately unbuckled her seatbelt and prepared to get out of the car. Suddenly, Xiao Haizhou's gloomy voice came from behind. "There will be a Xiao family dinner this weekend. You must accompany me." Jiang Luzi was instinctively reluctant. But if she didn't agree, Xiao Haizhou would definitely not let her go. She didn't want to get rid of him by sleeping with him, and she didn't want him to complain to her adoptive father again. "Until I figure out how to completely cut off ties with him, I can only endure it." Jiang Luzi didn't say anything else and got out of the car. Xiao Haizhou stared at her resolutely leaving back, his brows covered with gloom again. He lit a cigarette in annoyance and smoked it dejectedly. I don't know how long it took, but a series of cell phone rings rang out in the quiet carriage. "Haizhou, it's me." Zhuang Yichuan's sweet and coquettish voice was heard. "What's up?" Xiao Haizhou took a puff of his cigarette and responded coldly. "Fu Qianyun is not at home tonight, let's meet at the usual place." Zhuang Yichuan invited enthusiastically. She and Jiang Luzi were college classmates and were at the age of being as beautiful as a flower. But she married Fu Qianyun, who was nearly 30 years older than her. Although she married into a wealthy family, she had no worries about food and clothing and lived the life of a wealthy lady. But there is just a little bit of sadness that is unknown to others. After all, Fu Qianyun is old and can't satisfy her at all. Even if he took the medicine, he couldn't last long. Zhuang Yichuan could only secretly solve his own needs outside. Xiao Haizhou is of similar age to her and is young and energetic. Most importantly, his identity as the fiancé of Fu Qianyun's adopted daughter can help them cover up very well. So he naturally became the target of her extramarital affair, and she took him down in the lounge of the last banquet. But how can once be enough? Zhuang Yichuan has a big appetite now. Just want to be satisfied immediately. But Xiao Haizhou was not interested. "I'm not free tonight." He was drunk that night and treated her as Jiang Lu's substitute. There is no shortage of women around him. "I have little interest in this, Zhuang Yichuan." "Haizhou, I've been thinking about you these days." Zhuang Yichuan deliberately tempted. "If you come to accompany me, I can also tell you about Lu Sai's past." When Xiao Haizhou heard her mention Jiang Luzi, a glimmer flashed across his eyes. "Wait for me." He hung up the phone, stepped on the accelerator, and went to the appointment. Zhuang Yichuan's pretty little face twisted for a moment. She knew that Xiao Haizhou was interested in that little bitch Jiang Luzi. If she didn't mention her, she wouldn't be able to make an appointment with Xiao Haizhou tonight. Zhuang Yichuan was filled with hatred. Not only did the old man she married treat her as a substitute, but now she has finally hooked up with a young and strong lover outside. In the end, she was treated as a substitute. Sooner or later, she will chop that bitch Jiang Luzi into pieces. Chapter 20. Ask her to help introduce him. Jiang Luzi went home and took a shower. When I came out, I heard my cell phone ringing. When she dried her hair and walked over to pick up the phone, the call had already been hung up. A message popped up on the screen. "Lu Sai, I just ran into Zhuang Yichuan dressed sexy and seductively entering a club. She must be trying to have sex with someone." The person who sent the message was called Mary. She is Jiang Luzi's college classmate and best friend. She and Zhuang Yichuan used to be in the same dormitory. Mei knew Zhuang Yichuan earlier than Jiang Luzi. They are both from City B, went to the same high school, and were admitted to university together. Originally, their relationship was even better than Jiang Luzi's. But ever since Zhuang Yichuan stole Mei Li's boyfriend of 5 years, Qin Lun, the two of them fell out. Afterwards, Zhuang Yichuan pretended to be friends with Jiang Luzi. Later, Jiang Luzi discovered that Zhuang Yichuan was coming for her adoptive father Fu Qianyun. After Zhuang Yichuan quickly hooked up with her adoptive father Fu Qianyun, she dumped Mei Li's ex-boyfriend. I also moved out of the dormitory and stopped associating with them. Jiang Luzi and Mei Li became good friends because of this and they still keep in touch. The missed call just now was also from Mary. She was in a club today discussing business with a client, and when she came out to use the restroom, she happened to run into Zhuang Yichuan, who was dressed up and looked furtive. At first glance, it looks like he's here for a hookup. Jiang Luzi was not surprised at all. After all, her adoptive father Fu Qianyun is old. Ever since her mother passed away, she has been devastated, depressed, and has been in poor health over the years. How could one satisfy Zhuang Yichuan who was in her youth? Before she could reply, Mary sent her another photo. Jiang Luzi clicked it and took a look. It is a photo of a man and a woman kissing in an elevator. Despite the dim light, she recognized at a glance that the man who was kissing Zhuang Yichuan passionately in the elevator was her fiancé Qiao Haozhou, who had just sent her back. Mary called her again soon after. Jiang Luzi swiped to answer the call, and heard Meili ask in shock, "Cici, have you seen the photo? Zhuang Yichuan is actually together with Qiao Haozhou." Jiang Luzi responded calmly, "Yeah." Meili was even more surprised to see that she was not surprised at all. "You already know." Jiang Luzi laughed, "I've seen it with my own eyes before." "Depend on." Meili angrily cursed on the phone, "Zhuang Yichuan, this bitch, why does she like to steal other people's boyfriends? She first pried her away, then hooked up with Jiang Luzi's adoptive father, and now she's still unrepentant and even slept with Jiang Luzi's fiancé. As the saying goes, flies don't bite seamless eggs. Qiao Haozhou also has problems." Jiang Luzi said calmly. "That's true, but Zhuang Yichuan is too shameless." Mary scolded her on the phone for half an hour. Jiang Luzi was also very angry at first, but after hearing Meili say everything she wanted to say, she was not so angry anymore. "Dirty man and slutty woman, I think they are a good match." She curled her lips coldly and comforted her friend instead. Meili asked seriously, "Cici, when are you going to break up your engagement with Qiao Haozhou? You don't really want to marry such a scumbag, do you?" Ever since Qiao Haozhou first had an affair with another woman, Meili had advised her to break up. As a best friend, she really doesn't want Jiang Luzi to marry a stud who has a lot of women outside in the future. Jiang Luzi rubbed his temple, "It's almost there." The two best friends chatted for a while. Jiang Luzi asked Meili to take a few more photos for her to keep as evidence so that she could confront Qiao Haozhou later. Naturally, Mary agreed immediately. The next day, Jiang Luzi entered the company and began to follow up on the follow-up matters of the cooperation project with President Zhao. The project cooperation went smoothly. Near the end of the meeting, Mr. Zhao suddenly invited her to dinner. Jiang Luzi originally thought that Mr. Zhao wanted to discuss the finalization of the project with her in person, so she went to the appointment without thinking too much. Who knew that Mr. Zhao actually mentioned Zhang Xiao to her? "Ms. Jiang, I'd like to ask you to help me get in touch with Mr. Zhang." Mr. Zhao smiled and told his real intention tonight. Jiang Luzi was slightly stunned. Then he smiled and said, "What's the problem? I'll introduce you to Mr. Zhao some other day." Mr. Zhao smiled and said, "Since Miss Jiang has agreed, let's not postpone it to another day. Let's do it tonight." "Tonight?" Jiang Luzi was surprised. Mr. Zhao smiled and complimented, "Miss Jiang is Mr. Zhang's favorite woman, so I guess it won't be a problem at any time." Jiang Luzi's heart sank. She still maintained a smile on her pretty face. "Originally it's not a problem, but Mr. Zhang has been busy with work recently, so I'm afraid it won't be possible tonight." Mr. Zhao couldn't help but question, "Is Mr. Zhang always so busy?" You know, when Jiang Luzi was following up on the cooperation recently, Mr. Zhao always took the opportunity to mention Zhang Xiao to her from time to time, wanting her to help introduce him. But Jiang Luzi always found various excuses to refuse. Now their collaborative project is coming to an end. If I don't find an opportunity to meet Zhang Xiao now, I'm afraid there will be no chance in the future. Or is it that the relationship between Miss Jiang and President Zhang is just talk? Mr. Zhao narrowed his eyes and asked tentatively. Jiang Luzi's heart trembled slightly. I know that when Mr. Zhao said this, he was doubting her relationship with Zhang Xiao. They have been working together for quite some time, but for all this time Mr. Zhao couldn't tell that Jiang Luzi had any connection with Zhang Xiao. He asked her for introductions many times, but nothing happened in the end. It is normal for President Zhao to have doubts. Jiang Luzi gritted her teeth and continued to smile. I do have a close relationship with President Zhang. At least they had slept for a night. How can they not be closely related? She did not lie to Mr. Zhao in this regard. But her relationship with Zhang Xiao only lasted that night. She had only been a woman who shone for one night during the war. Afterwards, Zhang Xiao asked them to continue their relationship, but she refused. How could she have the nerve to introduce Mr. Zhao now? Boss Zhang has always been very doting on me. We were together last night. But he really had a lot of things to do today, so let's do it next time. Jiang Luzi knew very well that the reason she was able to get Mr. Zhao to sign the contract and subsequently cooperate with her smoothly was entirely because of Zhang Xiao. Mr. Zhao always wanted to use her to get close to a top-level dignitary like Zhang Xiao, so he gave her this face. If he discovered her true relationship with Zhang Xiao, she would probably be in big trouble. So even if it was against her will, she had to describe her relationship with Zhang Xiao as if it were real in front of President Zhao. Little did she know that almost all of her conversation with Mr. Zhao was overheard by Zhang Xiao. This hotel happens to be owned by Rong Shushi. Just now when Jiang Luzi and Mr. Zhao walked into the box, they happened to be bumped into by Zhang Xiao. At this moment, everything she and Mr. Zhao did in the box was under Zhang Xiao's surveillance. Chapter 22, Admit that you are his woman. Mr. Zhao immediately seemed like a different person. Boss Zhang, what brings you here? He stretched out his hand to Zhang Xiao from a distance and greeted him with a smile. During the war, Yao Jun's face was cold and indifferent. His slender figure, wrapped in a first-class tailored suit, exudes an exceptionally powerful aura. He simply ignored the hand that Mr. Zhao extended to him and strode to the sofa. He reached out and helped Jiang Luzi up, holding her in his arms. Turning to look at Mr. Zhao, what do you want to do with my woman? One word, one action. He has already declared his ownership of Jiang Luzi. Jiang Luzi, who was held in his arms, was completely dumbfounded. She never expected that Zhang Xiao would really come. What's more, she didn't expect that Zhang Xiao would cooperate with her in acting so well. She actually admitted in person, right in front of Mr. Zhao, that she was his woman. Mr. Zhao stood there in shock for a few seconds. Now there was no doubt at all. Jiang Luzi has already obtained President Zhang's personal certification, how could it be false? It's a misunderstanding, it's all a misunderstanding. I was just joking with Miss Jiang. Mr. Zhao hurriedly put on a smile. Misunderstand? Zhang Xiao glared at him sternly with his dark eyes. Why did I just hear Mr. Zhao say that he wanted my woman to serve you? Mr. Zhao was instantly frightened and broke out in a cold sweat. That's absolutely not true. How dare I? His lips were trembling. He was afraid that Zhang Xiao would kill him if he disagreed with him. Anyone who had offended this living devil in the past would suffer the consequences. He is even more terrifying than the Azura of hell. I don't think you would dare. Zhang Xiao interrupted him. A huge pressure came over like the god of death, forcing people to have no way to hide. Mr. Zhao's legs were shaking and he felt creepy. I regret it so much now. I regretted that I had believed the slander of the treacherous person. He thought Jiang Luzi was playing tricks on him. During this battle, Yezhen appeared to help her. How could he afford to offend him? Yes. Mr. Zhao wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and nodded cautiously. If he had known that Jiang Luzi was Zhang Xiao's woman, he would not have dared to touch her even if he had 100 times the courage. Boss Zhang, you, please take a seat. He immediately put on a drooling face and warmly welcomed them. During the war, Yao didn't give him any face at all. I have something else to do. I won't sit down anymore. Mr. Zhao didn't dare to have any objection, and nodded and smiled at him. Mr. Zhang, I'll take you there. Zhang Xiao was like an ancient emperor, with a cold face, walking towards the door with Jiang Luzi in his arms. From beginning to end, he never even looked at Mr. Zhao. Mr. Zhao smiled apologetically and personally bent down to walk him to the door of the box. He then politely said a few pleasantries to Zhang Xiao and waited for them to leave. He breathed a sigh of relief when he saw them go away. He was upset that he almost offended Zhang Xiao just now. Thinking of the wrong message he received, Mr. Zhao couldn't swallow it. So he picked up his phone and scolded the person who told him that Jiang Luzi was already engaged. Jiang held the phone in her hand, feeling indescribably aggrieved. I thought I could successfully ruin the cooperation between Jiang Luzi and Mr. Zhao and make Jiang Luzi lose such a big client as Mr. Zhao. Who would have thought that she would be scolded by Mr. Zhao for more than 10 minutes? But I didn't dare to refute or hang up the phone. But she was full of dissatisfaction in her heart. Why was she scolded by Mr. Zhao? She was not wrong. Jiang Luzi was already engaged and had a fiancé, which was common knowledge in their company. But Mr. Zhao had actually asked her before whether Jiang Luzi had any backers. Could it be that Jiang Luzi really has some shady backing and was discovered by President Zhao? Mr. Zhao hung up the phone angrily, and when he looked up he realized something was wrong. The atmosphere in the box was eerily quiet. All his men who were guarding the door were gone. He was terrified and was about to escape to the door. At this time, all the lights in the box went out. Mr. Zhao was kicked by someone in the dark and fell to the ground like a dog. With a click, the sound of bones breaking came from his wrist. Before he could call for help, he felt himself surrounded by a gloomy aura. Then a burst of punching and kicking sounds were heard. The whole box was filled with the screams of pigs being slaughtered. Zhang Xiao held Jiang Lu's waist, walked out of the club, and got into his luxury car. The murderous aura between his eyebrows had dissipated a lot, but his handsome face was still very cold. Jiang Lu took the initiative to thank him. "Boss Zhang, thank you so much for what you did just now." If he hadn't appeared in time, the consequences would have been disastrous. She is very likely to have been. Zhang Xiao suddenly lowered his head and stared at her with dark eyes. "How do you thank me?" Jiang Lu was stunned. She was just being polite. She never thought that he would actually ask her to thank her. "I will treat Mr. Zhang to dinner tomorrow," she said with a cheerful smile. Zhang Xiao's eyes were covered with a layer of cold frost. "I need a meal from you." Jiang Lu's smile suddenly froze. She naturally knew that he couldn't be missing. But other than that, she didn't know how to thank him. Just when she was at a loss, Zhang Xiao's handsome face without any flaws suddenly approached her. Less than a centimeter away. The tips of their noses almost touched. Jiang Lu saw her own blushing and flustered face in his dark eyes. "You?" She really didn't know what he wanted to do, and subconsciously stepped back. Zhang Xiao stretched out his slender fingers and pinched her jaw. She wasn't allowed to back down. "Have you thought about it?" he suddenly asked in a hoarse voice. Jiang Lu's mind went blank for a few seconds. Looked at him with confusion. What to consider? "Be my woman." Zhang Xiao stared at her. Jiang Lu was stunned for a moment. Only then did I realize that this was what Zhang Xiao was talking about. She has been busy following up on the cooperation project with Mr. Zhao recently and has no time to think about anything else. Besides, she and Xiao Haozhou haven't broken off their engagement yet, so how can she be his woman? "I don't." Jiang Lu was about to refuse. During the battle, Yao suddenly increased the strength of his men. Agreed. His eyes were burning. Jiang Lu looked a little confused. "When will I?" Zhang Xiao's expression was particularly deep. "You admitted it to Mr. Zhao yourself." Jiang Lu blinked. "I didn't." She defended herself subconsciously. Zhang Xiao refused to let her go. "Not only did you admit tonight that you are my woman, you also said that I have always doted on you. We were together last night." His bottomless eyes stared at her, his thin lips teasing, but his expression was even colder and more serious. Jiang Lu couldn't help but take a breath when she heard that. She stared at him with wide eyes. An expression of disbelief. How could he know what she said to Mr. Zhao in the box tonight? Jiang Lu's scalp numbed when he stared at her, and she couldn't give him a reasonable explanation. "I had no choice but to be thick-skinned and deny it." "Boss Zhang, are you kidding me? How dare I?" Chapter 23 agreed to stay with him at the hotel for one night. Zhang Xiao tapped his phone lightly. Her original voice rang out clearly in the luxury car. "Boss Zhang and I do have a close relationship. Boss Zhang has always doted on me, and we were together last night." Jiang Lu's eyes widened. Look at him in disbelief. How did he get this recording? Could it be that he had monitored her every move with Mr. Zhao in the box just now? "I think Miss Jiang is very brave." His eagle-like eyes narrowed slightly during the war, revealing a cold light. Jiang Lu's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Stiff back. The cold air emanating from his body caused beads of sweat to appear on his forehead. "Boss Zhang, can you please forgive me?" She swallowed her saliva and begged for mercy hurriedly. "I was forced to do so by the situation, so I had the audacity to borrow your name." If she had known that Zhang Xiao would find out, she would not have dared to do it even if she had 10,000 courage. Zhang Xiao's dark eyes were sharp and cold. "Ms. Jiang, my name is not so easy to borrow." He looked very unhappy. His brows were furrowed. The carriage was suddenly filled with cold air. Jiang Lu was under great pressure and swore tremblingly, "I promise, this won't happen again." Zhang Xiao narrowed his eyes. "That's it." Jiang Lu asked reluctantly, "What else do you want, Mr. Zhang?" Zhang Xiao leaned closer to her, his eyes particularly meaningful. "Don't you know what I want?" As he said this, his hot breath touched the skin of her cheek. The heat made Jiang Luzi feel dazed and at a loss. Boss Jean, I? Her heart suddenly began to beat irregularly. Zhang Xiao stared at her deeply. There was no further movement, just staring at her. There were some emotions in his eyes that she couldn't understand. Just being stared at by him in such an extremely dangerous way made Jiang Luzi tense up all over. She looked away instinctively. Zhang Xiao looked at her, who was deliberately avoiding his gaze, and his eyes became deep and dark. After a while, he suddenly said, "Stay with me for one night, and I'll forgive you for all the debts you owe me." How about that? Jiang Luzi's temple suddenly jumped. She looked up and looked at him in surprise. It took me a while to realize what he meant by that sentence. Just to keep you company for one night, she asked uncertainly. Zhang Xiao raised his thin lips in a wicked and sarcastic arc. "Miss Jiang, do you want to stay with me for a few more nights?" Jiang Luzi's beautiful eyes flashed. I remembered Yao's entanglement and coercion during the war. She frowned in confusion. "You asked me to be your woman before." Zhang Xiao's stern expression darkened. Something flashed across his deep eyes. "A woman for one night," he emphasized in a cold voice. Jiang Luzi was stunned for a moment, as if she understood everything in an instant. It turned out that Zhang Xiao just wanted her to pay back the debt she owed for that night. She thought he was attracted by her body and wanted her to be his lover forever. Okay, just one night. Jiang Luzi gritted her teeth and made a decision. Anyway, Zhang Xiao is handsome and has a good figure, so it's worth it for her to sleep with him for a night. Besides, she was the one who provoked him before. Then she kicked him there, vomited all over him, and even looked at him naked. During this period of time, he has been using his name to negotiate cooperation with me. If she doesn't sleep with a man as powerful as Zhang Xiao, she will probably have to bear the consequences in the future. Now that we have reached an agreement, there is no need to be awkward anymore. During the war, Yao ordered the driver to drive the luxury car to a nearby 5-star hotel. As soon as the luxury car stopped, Zhang Xiao got out first. Jiang Luzi clenched her fists and followed him out of the car. But when she entered the hotel, she was obviously hesitant. After all, it was the first time I checked into a hotel with a man. Jiang Luzi has always been strictly disciplined by her adoptive father and has never had such an extraordinary and bold experience. If her adoptive father knew that she had gone against his wishes and checked into a hotel with another man, thus ruining his marriage plans, he probably would not let her off easily. Jiang Luzi thought anxiously and slowed down her pace. Zhang Xiao, who was walking in front, so that she had not caught up yet, and could not help but turned his head and frowned. I thought she was dithering, maybe she wanted to go back on her word. He walked straight over, grabbed her hand, and strode towards the hotel lobby. The moment their hands touched, Jiang Luzi came back to her senses. She stiffened her neck, lowered her eyes to look at Zhang Xiao's tightly held hand, then looked up at his tall and straight back. For some reason, she had an illusion. Are they a couple in love? Instead of just going for a date. In a blink of an eye, Zhang Xiao had already checked in at the front desk, requested a presidential suite, and dragged her towards the elevator. He never let go of her hand from beginning to end. As if he was afraid that she would run away. Jiang Luzi really wanted to escape. I felt indescribably nervous and scared. But she knew better that now that it had come to this, she could no longer retreat. You have to do it despite your hard work. Who made her sleep with him before? How could it be so easy for her to get on with a powerful man like Zhang Xiao? We have to let him go back to sleep. With a ding sound, the elevator door opened. Zhang Xiao took the room card to open the door to the suite. Before she had time to turn on the light after entering, Jiang Luzi's body was pressed against the wall at the door, and he closed the door with his foot. The door slammed shut, plunging the entire suite into darkness. Jiang Luzi was not prepared at all, and Zhang Xiao's kiss had already fallen. He fiercely blocked her red lips and pried open her pearly teeth. The big palm moved along the curves of her body, bringing out a burning sensation. Soon Jiang Luzi was trembling with fear. She is very sensitive and delicate. During the war, Yao's breathing became turbid and rapid. The movements of his men couldn't help but become more vigorous and brutal. With a hissing sound, the dress on Jiang Luzi turned into pieces in his hands. She couldn't help but gasp, frightened by his rude side. You. Her eyelashes trembled and she was about to accuse something. The red lips were pressed down by Zhang Xiao again. Be good, I'll give you a new one tomorrow, he whispered in her ear. The heavy breath sprayed on her ears. Jiang Luzi just felt like she was in a furnace. The body temperature is rising little by little. The familiar yet unfamiliar masculine scent from Zhang Xiao made her instinctively feel danger. She pushed her hands towards his chest reflexively. No, wait. This is too fast. She was totally unprepared. Zhang Xiao rested his forehead against hers. What are you waiting for? His voice was low and hoarse at this time, and he didn't want to wait any longer. Jiang Luzi couldn't push him away as he was pressing down on her like a huge mountain. All the blood in my body rushed to my face. Her face and ears were all red. I really can't stand him like this. Jiang Luzi tilted her head to avoid his slightly heavy and hot breath. Go take a shower first. Chapter 24. Her hand was broken, but she had a backer. Wash after you're done. Zhang Xiao panted. He is tall and strong. Jiang Luzi is slender and pretty. The posture of the two at this moment, she was almost wrapped in his arms, kissing her without leaving any room for him. Jiang Luzi's brain was deprived of oxygen for a moment. The body trembled uncontrollably as if it were struck by an electric current. I felt dazed, as if I had suddenly lost everything. Until a cell phone rang urgently. During the war, Yao stopped attacking. Release her temporarily. He took out his cell phone and answered the call. After a moment, he frowned and said, I'll be there right away. The coldness in his eyes had returned. Jiang Luzi was in his arms at this time, and naturally felt the cold aura emanating from him. Something must have happened. Well, tonight, they can't do it. Jiang Luzi subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the call came in time. Mr. Zhang, you. She started tentatively. Continue next time. Zhang Xiao frowned slightly and let go completely. Jiang Luzi instinctively squatted down and picked up the clothes scattered on the ground. But her dress had just been shattered into pieces in his hands. How could she wear it now? Wait here, I'll have someone bring you some clothes later. Zhang Xiao glanced at her and said to her in a low voice. After saying that, he left first. Jiang Luzi wanted to say no need to bother, but her clothes were half undressed and she had nothing to wear. You can't just go out in your underwear. She could only stay in the hotel suite and wait for Zhang Xiao to send someone to bring her clothes. Fortunately, not long after, one of Zhang Xiao's female assistants brought her a dress. This female assistant is called Lisa, and she is a capable assistant to Zhang Xiao. This was the first time that Zhang Xiao sent her to do this kind of thing, so she couldn't help but look at Jiang Luzi a few more times. Jiang Luzi accepted the other party's scrutiny generously without thinking too much about it. After she changed her clothes, Lisa offered to take her home. Don't bother, I'll take a taxi myself. Jiang Luzi felt the hostility from this woman and didn't want to have much dealings with her. Lisa said with a cold face, this is what the boss wants, Miss Jiang should not disobey. There was a hint of coercion in her tone. Jiang Luzi raised her eyebrows. I didn't intend to stick with her to the end over such a small matter. So Lisa was asked to send her back. There was no communication between the two of them throughout the whole process. Jiang Luzi could see that this female assistant named Lisa was only there to complete the task assigned by Zhang Xiao. I didn't say much. After returning to her apartment, Jiang Luzi took a shower and went to bed. With Zhang Xiao helping her tonight, I'm sure Mr. Zhao will never dare to doubt her again, let alone provoke her again. It will also be much easier to finish the project later. It saved her a lot of trouble. Only. As a result, she had no choice but to agree to let Zhang Xiao accompany him for one night. Although there was an emergency call later, interrupting their passion. But she owed him this night, and sooner or later he would get it back. Thinking of Zhang Xiao's fierce kiss tonight, his rough movements, Jiang Luzi couldn't help but shiver. She had a feeling that this night with him would not be an easy one. Hospital emergency room. When Zhang Xiao arrived, the doctor had just come out. How is my sister? He quickly stepped forward and asked. The doctor took off his mask and said, fortunately, she was sent to the hospital in time. Miss Zhang is no longer in danger of life for the time being. When will she wake up? Zhang Xiao continued to ask. Dr. Du sighed, Boss Zhang, I told you before that your sister was seriously injured in the last traffic accident and may not wake up in the future. Zhang Xiao's handsome face suddenly tensed and solemn when he heard this. After the doctor left, Zhang Nisha was pushed out by the nurse and sent to the VIP ward. Zhang Xiao followed him and saw the old maid Anchen standing by the bed. Seeing Zhang Xiao coming in, she quickly stood up and called out respectfully, "Young master." During the war, Yao pursed his lips tightly, his features looked solemn and cold. "What's going on?" His low and cold voice suddenly sounded. Anchen's eyes flickered. He stood there with his head down, not answering for a long while. "Explain." During wartime, his eyes were sharp and deep, like a sharp sword. Anchen was so frightened that she trembled all over. "Master, I don't know anything." Zhang Xiao's deep and cold black eyes locked onto her. "Who has been here today?" Anchen stiffened. She lowered her eyes, not daring to look him in the eye. "Madam, I came here in the evening." After a long while, she answered in a low voice. During the war, Yao's eyes narrowed. As if he realized something in an instant. "My mother has been here." His face turned gloomy and fierce. His brows were furrowed. Their whole body seemed to be shrouded in a thick black fog. Anchen didn't dare to hide it. She answered fearfully, "After the madam came to see Miss. Miss became ill." Zhang Xiao pursed his thin lips into a straight line. The deep cold eyes became deeper and darker. Until a layer of haze covered it, terrifying. Ice cold. The atmosphere in the entire ward became extremely cold and suffocating. The next day, when Jiang Luzi went to the company, she learned shocking news. Mr. Zhao was beaten up by a group of people and was sent to the hospital last night. One of his hands was even broken. He is now lying in the hospital and cannot be released for a while. However, he had already arranged for his subordinates to liaise with Jiang Luzi to complete the project he was cooperating on with their company. The man was in awe of Jiang Luzi, even a little afraid of her. He didn't even dare to shake Jiang Luzi's hand. He treated her with utmost respect throughout the whole process, almost treating her like a queen. The project, which was originally supposed to take another half-month to complete, was successfully completed within a week. Manager Chen Yuan praised her highly. I praised her in front of everyone in the sales department. Jiang Yi's face was completely black. Although he didn't dare to object on the surface, he was still dissatisfied in his heart. Doesn't Jiang Luzi still have someone to rely on? What's so great about that? Once she finds out who the shameful backer behind Jiang Luzi is, she will expose and embarrass her sooner or later. Jiang Luzi received the bonus and commission from Mr. Zhao's project in advance. She is in a good mood. Last time, Xiao Haozhou failed to invite Luo Xiaoran, so he will make up for it tonight. After work, the two went to eat hot pot together. "Lu Sai, the man who came to pick you up last time was your fiancé, right?" Luo Xiaoran suddenly asked. Jiang Lu thought of Xiao Haozhou and responded without any emotion, "Yeah." Luo Xiaoran added, "He looks so familiar, he looks a bit like the second young master Xiao who often appears in gossip magazines." Jiang Luzi just drank a glass of juice and almost spit it out. How can they be similar? Her fiancé is Xiao Haozhou himself. But she has been hiding her identity since she came to work at Xingmao. In order to avoid exposing her identity, she was not in a position to reveal too much to Luo Xiaoran. Chapter 25, I met him at a family dinner with my fiancé. Weekend dinner at the Xiao family. Xiao Haozhou was waiting for her downstairs of her apartment building early in the morning. It was as if he was afraid that Jiang Luzi would really turn against him and not accompany him. Jiang Luzi deliberately made him wait downstairs for more than an hour before slowly going downstairs. "Luz, you are so charming tonight." Xiao Haozhou's originally gloomy and impatient face immediately showed a smile after seeing her. He strode towards Jiang Luzi and put his arm around her shoulders. There was an undisguised look of amazement in his eyes. Jiang Luzi dodged his arms without leaving a trace and walked straight forward. In fact, she didn't want to accompany Xiao Haozhou to attend the Xiao family dinner anymore. Unfortunately, their engagement has not been cancelled yet. If she refused to attend, she would have a hard time explaining to her adoptive father. Jiang Luzi didn't dress up tonight. She only wore a silver white long dress and her makeup was very light. But the close-fitting cut still perfectly shows off her exquisite curves. The moment Xiao Haozhou saw her, his throat tightened and his pupils became darker. Although he had seen countless women, he had to admit that Jiang Luzi was the most beautiful and had the best figure among all the women he had ever seen. It's just that Jiang Luzi is more aloof and difficult to deal with than anyone else. He had been engaged to her for such a long time, but she had never let him touch her once. And he had been concerned about her adoptive father Fu Chenyun, so he had been holding back and didn't dare to really touch her. Thinking about it now, he couldn't help but feel a little regretful and annoyed. Such a beauty is his fiancée. But he hasn't tasted her yet. Isn't that a waste of God's gift? As soon as Jiang Luzi got in the car, she saw Qiao Haizhou's wolf-like green eyes falling on her. It made her feel extremely uncomfortable. She deliberately moved towards the car window to keep a distance from him. Unexpectedly, Qiao Haizhou was so bold as to grab her hand. "Let go." Jiang Luzi frowned in disgust. Why does this man always touch her in the car recently? "Cece, I know what you are angry about." Qiao Haizhou stared at her with an evil look on his face. Before Jiang Luzi could speak, he just laughed to himself. "Aren't you jealous? There are so many women around me, aren't you?" Jiang Luzi was speechless. "Which eye of yours so that I was jealous of you?" She couldn't help but sarcastically. I almost laughed out loud. Where does Qiao Haizhou get such confidence? You don't have to deny it. Qiao Haizhou looked as if he had seen through her, his thin lips raised in triumph. I know there are many beautiful women around me. After all, it's normal for a man of my status and position to have women throwing themselves at him. Jiang Luzi just rolled her eyes. But Qiao Haizhou seemed not to notice her impatience at all, and he continued to assure her self-righteously. But don't worry, no matter how I play outside, you are the only one who can be the second young lady of Qiao. Jiang Luzi just found it funny. Why do you think I care so much about your position as the second young lady of Qiao? He almost cheated on her like the Hulenbar grassland. She will not marry anyone else but him. Just for this unwarranted position of the second young lady of the Qiao family. Is she crazy? Cece, your engagement with me was decided by the elders of both families. Our union must be a strong alliance. After we get married, if you give me a few more children, your position as the second grandmother of Qiao will definitely be secure. By then, your adoptive father and my parents will all be satisfied. That is something that no woman outside can envy. Qiao Haizhou was still speaking with certainty, trying to brainwash her into continuing to compromise and maintain the engagement with him. However, she didn't realize that while she was talking, an ambiguous lipstick mark under her neck had been exposed. Needless to say, it must be that one of the women outside Qiao Haizhou's relationship found out that he was going to attend a family dinner with his fiancée tonight, and she stayed behind on purpose to demonstrate to her. But this woman seemed to have chosen the wrong person. Jiang Luzi didn't care at all about the troubles that Qiao Haizhou had outside. She doesn't care even if he has affairs with other women outside. Because she never really thought about marrying Qiao Haizhou. As for Qiao Haizhou's so-called strong alliance and having more children with him after marriage, it was even more of a fantasy for Jiang Luzi. It's simply impossible. Jiang Luzi didn't even look at him, and said coldly. You don't care about my adoptive father anymore. She still hasn't forgotten what Qiao Haizhou said to her last time in his car. He told her himself that he had never touched her because he knew she was his adoptive father's woman. Jiang Lu simply didn't make any excuses and let him continue to misunderstand her. When Qiao Haizhou heard her mention her adoptive father Fu Chenyun, his expression suddenly turned very ugly. His clenched fists made a creaking sound. A hint of forbearance flashed across the dark and obscure eyes. He knew very well that if Jiang Luzi and her adoptive father Fu Chenyun really had that kind of relationship, even if he really married Jiang Luzi as he wished, Fu Chenyun would not let him touch Jiang Luzi after marriage. Not to mention letting Jiang Luzi give birth to a child for him. Qiao Haizhou's expression was extremely gloomy. The crazy facial features became distorted. He didn't speak again until they arrived at the villa where the party was to be held tonight. Jiang Luzi was just enjoying her free time. Yinyuan Villa is a famous holiday resort in City A, specializing in accommodating upper-class people. Tonight's Qiao family dinner is held on the top floor of the catering department of Yinyuan Villa. Jiang Luzi and Qiao Haizhou just got off the car. I ran into a group of people head-on. The man in the lead was tall and straight, wearing a black shirt and narrow trousers. His broad shoulders and narrow waist showed perfect body proportions. The lines on his face were as deep as if they were cut by a knife or an axe. He put one hand in his trouser pocket and said nothing. But the aura he exuded was sharp and powerful, and he looked as noble and arrogant as a king. Jiang Luzi didn't expect to meet Zhang Xiao by such a coincidence. They checked into a hotel a week ago, but he suddenly had something to do and we lost contact since then. Seeing this happen in such a situation, she couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed and embarrassed. And Yao is not alone during the war. There were several men following behind him. Each one is very noble. At first glance, he is a wealthy young man from the upper class. The top dignitaries in Zhang Xiao's circle. One of them looked somewhat familiar to Jiang Luzi. Isn't he the young master Rong whom I met on the golf course before? Rong Shushi naturally recognized Jiang Luzi at a glance. He immediately nudged Zhang Xiao with his elbow. It's Miss Jiang? But why is there a man beside her? Could it be her fiancé, Mr. Chiao? Yao Juan's face was cold enough during the war. After hearing Rong Shushi's words, he felt even colder. There was an extremely frightening coldness and sharpness in his deep eyes. Jiang Luzi was hesitating whether she should pretend not to see it or just nod to them generously as a greeting. Unexpectedly, Xiao Haozhou beside her was the first to meet him. Chapter 27, Garden Affair. Fu Qianyun and Xiao Zhenhong shook hands. We exchanged a few more pleasantries. They both looked in the direction of Jiang Luzi and Xiao Haozhou at the same time. Xiao Haozhou understood and immediately took Jiang Luzi's arm and walked towards them. Xiao Zhenhong smiled and said, Haozhou, I have already discussed it with Mr. Fu. You and Lucai will get engaged next month. Xiao Haozhou immediately showed a happy expression. He held Jiang Luzi's hand hypocritically. That's great. I've been looking forward to marrying Lucai home for a long time. Everyone's eyes turned to Jiang Luzi. She had a lot of grievances. If you ask her what she really means, she would say she is absolutely unwilling. But she naturally couldn't really say it in front of her adoptive father and the two elders of the Che family. I could only smile perfunctorily. Not objecting in person was her biggest concession. That's settled then. The 18th of next month is a good day. You two can hold your engagement party then. Xiao Zhenhong was very happy. He hoped that his second son would get married and have children as soon as possible, so that their Che family could have more children. After all, the marriage between the Chiao and Fu families is a big event. Xiao Zhenhong and Fu Qianyun discussed some details of the engagement. Mrs. Chiao, Shen Fangqiu, was not Xiao Haozhou's biological mother, and was not interested in these details. She quickly went to talk to other female members of the Chiao family. Xiao Haozhou also left with Jiang Luzi. However, before they left, Jiang Luzi caught a glimpse of Zhuang Yichuan beside Fu Qianyun from the corner of her eye and threw a coquettish glance at Xiao Haozhou. Jiang Luzi really admires Zhuang Yichuan. She even dared to seduce her fiancé while being with her adoptive father. Isn't he afraid that his adoptive father will find out? Lucai, take a rest first. I have something else to do. I'll come to you later. Xiao Haozhou quickly let her go, gave her a brief explanation, and left in a hurry. Jiang Luzi wished she could be alone and not have to put on a show with Xiao Haozhou. However, as soon as Zhuang Yichuan threw a coquettish glance at her, Xiao Haozhou left her. It is obvious what he is going to do. Jiang Luzi really didn't expect Xiao Haozhou to be so impatient. Even at the Xiao family's family dinner, she could be seen hooking up with her stepmother Zhuang Yichuan. These two are truly an adulterous couple, a perfect match. Jiang Luzi curled her red lips in disdain. But in order to obtain evidence of Xiao Haozhou's affair, she still followed him quietly. Xiao Haozhou went down from the top floor and came to a garden with beautiful scenery downstairs. Not long after, Zhuang Yichuan also came over. Jiang Luzi saw the two of them looking around furtively. Seeing that no one noticed them, they walked along the path deeper into the garden. Jiang Luzi followed carefully. I saw the two of them kissing passionately in a dark corner. Soon the clothes were all over the floor. Jiang Luzi felt a chill when she saw this. How hungry these two are. But the more hungry they were, the more opportunities it gave her to catch them cheating. Jiang Luzi quickly picked up her phone and pointed the camera at the two of them. But at this time, Zhuang Yichuan seemed to have discovered the marks left by other women on Xiao Haozhou's neck. She pushed him away unhappily. You lied to me. Xiao Haozhou looked puzzled. How did I lie to you? Zhuang Yichuan asked angrily. You keep saying that you haven't touched Jiang Luzi, so why is there a kiss mark on your neck? Xiao Haozhou was stunned for a moment, then lowered his head and touched his neck. Something flashed across his eyes quickly. The kiss mark on his neck was certainly not left by Jiang Luzi. But saying that he had other women would only make Zhuang Yichuan even angrier. I could only lie to her. This kiss mark was indeed left by Jiang Luzi. She took the initiative to throw herself into my arms in the car on their way to the family dinner with me tonight, but I firmly pushed her away and definitely did not touch her. Jiang Luzi's mouth twitched fiercely when she heard that. My eyeballs almost fell out of my head in shock. Xiao Haozhou really dares to say anything nonsense. When did she take the initiative to throw herself into his arms in the car? He couldn't slander Zhuang Yichuan like this just to coax her into having an affair with him, right? Jiang Luzi was really angry. I didn't hold the phone firmly and almost dropped it to the ground. Fortunately, she squatted down in time and caught it. But this action caused a slight noise. Who? Xiao Haozhou noticed it sensitively and immediately turned around to look around. Jiang Luzi's breathing became tight with fear. If Xiao Haozhou and Zhuang Yichuan found out that she had witnessed their affair and was hiding here to take pictures, wouldn't they team up to silence her? Seeing Xiao Haozhou actually walking towards her, Jiang Luzi's heart trembled. Have you been discovered? What to do? She bent over and was about to leave, but her back hit a hard chest. Before Jiang Luzi could turn around, she was picked up by the waist. Xiao Haozhou came to the place where Jiang Luzi had just hidden, but did not see any figure. His tense expression finally relaxed. He has been a little nervous lately. Every time he plays with a woman, he always feels like someone is watching him. Haozhou, what's wrong? Zhuang Yichuan walked over and asked. Nothing, it should just be the sound of the wind. Xiao Haozhou hurriedly explained and pushed her against a tree trunk behind him. Baby, let's continue. His kiss fell impatiently. Zhuang Yichuan was reluctant to accept the offer. You really didn't touch Jiang Luzi. How can she be as interesting as you? If it weren't for the marriage, I wouldn't even look at her. Xiao Haozhou coaxed her while kissing her. Zhuang Yichuan smiled with satisfaction. Finally, she released her hand that was pressing against his chest and responded to him. Be gentle and don't leave any traces. She warned cautiously. What? Are you still afraid that the old guy at home will find out? Xiao Haozhou laughed mockingly. Hateful, oh? Both of their voices became hoarse with lust. They are very passionate here. On the other side, Jiang Luzi finally got rid of the arms that suddenly took her away. When she raised her head, she met those dark and deep eyes. Why you again? She whispered in disbelief. She never expected that it was Zhang Xiao who took her away again. Last time in the club, he took her to that room. At this moment in the night, only the bright moonlight enveloped them. You still have this hobby? Zhang Xiao glared at her and suddenly sneered. Jiang Luzi. What are your hobbies? Eavesdropping? Or watch live porn? And what a coincidence that the male lead both times was her fiancé Xiao Haozhou. The two of them looked at each other. All kinds of emotions surged. Just as she was thinking about whether she should find an excuse to cover it up, several voices searching for him suddenly came from not far away. Where's Yao? Why is he gone? You're not going back first, are you? That's impossible. We agreed to wait here. Jiang Luzi recognized a voice that sounded like his friend Rong Shushi. But during the war Yao remained motionless. Listen to the footsteps of those people getting closer. Jiang Luzi couldn't help but say, Boss John,